is shining, but I feel fear. What's within my soul? I feel my body like a stone, dismounted from my mighty throne. I feel so alone.
Hey, I'm Unfa. Welcome to another monthly live stream. This month it's very special. Me and my co-host John DeBard are having a very special guest. So I'm not gonna drawn out the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Davis, the creator of Ardour. Paul, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
I can hear you. I am here. I'm glad to be here, Unfa and John.
Yes.
How you doing, everyone? I'm here as well. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully I'm coming through. Looks like it.
So me and John are going to be looking at the chat for questions. If you have any questions for Paul, throw them in and we'll try to filter them out, and Paul is gonna answer the ones that he doesn't feel particularly assaulted with. And the rest is going to be pure improvisation because I think that's going quite well.
Robin says that there's a huge AV offset. Maybe it's just their end. But let's see if anyone else says so.
And the rest is going to be pure improvisation because I think that's going quite well.
Hello, chat.
On my side, it seems that it's fine. The question is, can you hear everyone balanced? Paul, can you say
Yes,
something?
Yes, this is Paul talking, so we can check on the balance.
Yeah. You see, we've done hours of preparations, but we always need some time on air to actually fix things or figure out if the levels are fine. All right. Paul, would you like to tell us something about yourself, specifically in the context of open source audio, Linux? How did you came around to making Ardour?
Sure. So I guess the story really starts in the late 90s when I was looking around for hobbies to go along with raising my young child at the time. And I'd always had a long interest in, I guess, electronic music. In particular, I thought maybe I would try to make some of that stuff myself, and bought myself a synthesizer and a hardware sequencer and stuff, and started fooling around with things, and realized after a relatively short period of time that it would be good to be able to record what I was doing. I think in retrospect, that's probably not true. It was very good that I didn't record what I was doing. But at the time, it seemed as though I should record what I was doing. And, I had been reading that, all of the cool kids those days were starting to record things on computers, and maybe I should do that. And since I had taken a vow in the 80s to never use Windows, I couldn't do that on Windows.
That's
Macintoshes seemed to be too expensive, and I didn't really want to deal with them. But I had been using Linux, or I had used Linux for a little while at my prior job, which may come up during the talk or may not, and thought, oh, well, let's have a look at this Linux operating system and see if there's anything for it. And there actually was a program back at that time called Multitrack, which promised to be a, in-the-box recording solution. And I thought, oh, this is great. I should just get some machine and I'll run Linux on it, and I can run Multitrack and record the weird things that I'm doing with my Oberheim. And it turned out, of course, that Multitrack was actually terrible, and you really couldn't do any of the things I needed to do with it. So I started out down the track of writing some little bits of software, initially just to do MIDI stuff, sequencing and control surface type things. And then at some point in 1999, RME bought out it was the first Hammerfall PCI audio interface. It had 24 channels. And I remember thinking, oh, if I had 24 channels, I could obviously make a masterpiece, because all musicians know that you just need more channels.
Of course.
If you have more channels, it's going to be great. So the next task was to write a driver for the RME, which was much easier than it sounds, since there already was a driver for it that had been written by a guy called Winfried Riesch in Austria. But it wasn't part of the kernel, and it hadn't been done in quite the right way. So I got the RME working. Now we had 24 channels in and out. And the next task was I had 24 channels in and out, but I couldn't really do anything with them. So the next task was to write something that I could record with. And that actually turned out to be much easier than you might think. I think I had 24-track recording working in less than a month. But the problem that we immediately ran into, or sorry, not we at that point, it was still just myself. The thing that immediately became clear was that it wasn't actually very much use. Just being able to record stuff and play it back the way that you would do it on a tape machine that you didn't want to cut the tape with. I mean, it's not useless, but all you could do is record stuff and play it back. And I was more interested in the possibilities of, editing and transforming things. So after a few months of working on this, multi-track recorder, I was happy to be joined by some other people. I had made the project open source from the beginning. There were a couple of other people around, and we sort of had a conversation and said, well, I guess we should just add an editor. How hard can it be? And that was in early 2001, and we're now in 2022, and I don't think the editor is finished. But I do know how hard it can be. And so, for the last 22 plus years, I've been working on Ardour, which is an open source digital audio workstation that runs on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows, as well as a few other operating systems or variants. And we are just about to release version 7 of the software.
Yeah, we've got some questions about Ardour 7. And obviously, part of why we are here is to talk about Ardour 7, because this is the long-awaited major version that hopefully will bring some long-awaited improvements. But, well, yeah. Maybe we can look at the chat questions, still referring to what you've said before. Okay, let's see. Maxu asks, hey, about Ardour's donation model, where one has to give money to give the ready-to-run program from the website, where one has to give money to get the ready-to-run program from the website, but the source code is free. Has this been an effective way of getting funding?
Yeah, it has. It's been a long, slow build. I was in a very fortunate position when I started working on Ardour that I didn't need to make a living from doing so. And so the first 8 or so years of the program, there was really no financial model for it. It was just a regular open source project. But at some point, I realized that my life situation was switching around and I needed to make an income again. And I actually got this idea from Radiohead, which is a band I'm not a huge fan of, but my son was at the time, or still is. And they had just released, I think, In Rainbows, using what they call a pay tunnel model, where you could download it, but you got to choose the price that you paid. And I think they were the first people to do this. They were certainly the first people that were, well publicized doing this. And I remember thinking, wow, what an amazing idea. You could just get the album and you could name the price for it. I wonder what would happen if we tried doing that with software. But I didn't really want to do, it's still open source. It's still GPL. Anyone can get the source code. Anyone can copy it, modify, and distribute it, and so on. And so it didn't really seem terribly likely that the model was going to be you have to pay in order to get the source code, because that wasn't part of the idea of this open source project. But the idea that there were a lot of people even at that point. We started doing this in about 2009, I think. And there were a lot of people for whom just building the program was really difficult. It was a big challenge, and they didn't really want to do that. And so one of the ideas that I had was, well, perhaps we could save people the hassle of building it. We could just offer a pre-built version, and they could pay for that. And if they still want the source code and they want to build it themselves, or they'd like to get edit from their Linux distribution, that's all totally fine. But if they'd like a version that we build for them and we sort of bless and provide some kind of a support commitment for it, perhaps that would work. And, it was slow in the beginning, but it's built up over the last 13 years or so, to the point now where the program, we're probably one of the most financially successful independent open source projects. We bring in enough to support myself at a reasonably comfortable middle class kind of life. We provide support for another person who works full time on the software, Robin Garius. And over the last few years, we've had actually a surplus, which we've slowly started using to support other aspects of the project, including documentation and stuff like that. So although it was a slow start, and it wouldn't be a process I would really recommend to somebody who is starting out with this kind of project today, it's actually worked quite well over the long haul.
Sweet. So I was trying to ask this in the first place, but I guess I was muted. Lurking is Life asked, how long did it take you to code Ardour to be in a working state? Which I guess should be interpreted as, how long did the editor take to get to a working state?
Does it work today?
I've made songs with it. So,
well, then I guess about 22 years. Let's see. So, the initial attempt that we made at the beginning, there was an existing open source audio file editor called SND, which is an amazing audio file editor, particularly if you're a hacker. It has Lisp as the extension language, and you can do all kinds of really insane stuff with it. And we somehow managed to convince its incredible author to port the whole thing to GTK so that we could use it, which he did in one weekend. And then we started using it and realized that it was not suitable. SND did all of its file I/O in a way that's not compatible with real-time work. It's totally based around the idea like you load the file you load the whole file into memory and you start working with it. So we did an initial version of the editor, which maybe took a month or so of sort of trying to integrate SND in, and realized that just wasn't going to work. It just didn't do things in the right way for something that was supposed to be doing real-time audio. And then after that, I think it was just mostly an incremental process. I would think probably within a month or two of us deciding to drop the SND integration effort, we probably had an editor. But pretty much every single day since then, the editor has changed and mostly improved and occasionally gone backwards. So it's really been a 20-year effort or so, and I'm sure that will just carry on out into the future. But because what people think the editor should do, what we want the editor to do, that just keeps expanding and growing. There is no fixed state where when we reach it, it's done.
Yeah, I guess that's the same with art or any kind of creative work where it's done when you call it done.
Yeah, or in this case, it's actually done when the users call it done, and the users will never call it done. So,
yep, I can guarantee that myself. I think I've reported more than 100 tickets into Ardour's development tracker. I remember that moment where I hit 100, and I was like, "What? Whoa! You must hate me by now."
No, we love good bug reports, and most of yours are pretty great. So,
well, that's a relief. There is a question in the chat, which is, I think, a really good one. Skyhawk77 asks, "Why would I use Ardour when one has a recent version of PreSonus StudioOne?"
That's a tricky and deep question. Or we could be dismissive of it as well. But I think more seriously, there's a lot of DAWs floating around. It always struck me I guess in the middle 2000s, like 2005 to 2015, and I would frequently make this comparison. If you look at image editing software, that was a time when there was really only one image editing program that the vast majority of the world knew about, and that was called Photoshop. And it became a verb in our culture, and in fact in cultures around the world. And that situation has changed somewhat today. There's now a multiplicity of them. But in the DAW world, there have been loads of DAWs right from the beginning. There's at least a dozen right now that anybody who's thinking of getting into digital audio workstations should think, is this the right DAW for me to use? They may have particular qualities or preferences. that they would impose on that. They might be concerned about using open source, for example. And if that was a concern of yours, then Ardour would be a fairly natural choice. You might be concerned about the type of workflow that you're involved in. Do you do completely in the box production, or are you doing more recording of people performing that ends up on a timeline which you then edit and move around? Your choice of DAW for both of those two workflows is probably going to be a little bit different. StudioOne's a great DAW. I mean, they've done a lot of really great design work. There's some really great workflows in there, and there's some really crappy workflows as well. We were watching a video last week of how you should do tempo mapping in StudioOne, and it looks cool in the video, and then you sit back and think about what they actually did and what they didn't do, and it's pretty terrible. So, you know, which DAW you choose to use will depend an awful lot on what type of workflow you think you're going to be using or will actually use. It depends on your level of commitment to things like free and open source software. It may depend a little bit on your platform. But, you know, the reality is that most of the DAWs that are out there at this point that more than 10 people have heard of are pretty great pieces of software, and you'll be able to do a lot with them. I would recommend that you sit down and try Ardour and StudioOne and decide which one you prefer. It might be that you prefer StudioOne, in which case you should use it. It might be that you prefer Ardour, then you should use that. Or if you have a commitment to free and open source software, then, you know, Ardour is definitely going to be preferential to you over StudioOne. So
this reminds me a little when I learned Pro Tools at school, and that was after I have had, like, I don't know, half a decade of experience working with Ardour, mostly Ardour 2 at that era. And I was like, man, I mean, Pro Tools has some nice ideas, but it feels so weird and clunky and needlessly limited and pointlessly skeuomorphic in some ways, like how the mixer is made, how you have a limited amount of slots for every track or like a mixer strip. And Ardour doesn't have these limitations. I felt like I wouldn't want to use Pro Tools even if it was also open source like Ardour. So that's also always preference. People just get used to stuff. I got used to Ardour first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are the workflows that work the best in each of the DAWs. I mean, most of the DAWs support more than one workflow. And you know, there's all kinds of little details that can really affect people. I mean, I remember hearing from Cubase users very early on, and in versions of Cubase, at least at that time, I was trying to think what this detail. It was to do with what happens when you solo a track, and I think that by default they only had exclusive solo. So the default behavior was that you click on solo on a track and you hear that track, and you click solo on another track, the other track gets muted, and now you hear this track. And that was the default behavior. And they had very strong opinions that must be the default. That's the only proper default for solo. And at that point, we didn't support that model of solo at all. We only had, I'm not even sure that there's a name for it, I guess non-exclusive solo. So we added that feature, and there is a preference item to control which one it uses. But, you know, that seems like a tiny thing to somebody that doesn't use a DAW or is not super into using them. But to a person who's already got very used to the idea that when I click on this button that says solo, just like it does in the other program, this is what it should do. It doesn't do it. It's crap. We have to work with that kind of experience and feeling all of the time. But as I said, I mean, my position is on DAWs these days is that, you know, if more than 10 people have heard of it, it's probably a pretty good piece of software. And, you know, if you think there's a reason why it might be the right tool for you, then you should try it out. But you should probably try it more than one at the same time, and try to form an opinion about which one is closer to the way that you like to think about things or like to go about doing things.
Yeah, the exclusive solo thing's kind of funny because I'm pretty sure that's the opposite of how hardware mixers work.
Yeah.
But let's see here. So Phoenix is wondering how Ardour 7's development has been compared to 6.
Ah, well, therein lies a long story. We released 6.9, I think, August of 2021. And in the background, while the build up to the release of 6.9 was happening, I had been spending a long time doing some fundamental architecture changes to the way that we represent time inside of the program. Things like where is this region, or where is this MIDI note, where is this control point for a plugin parameter, and so on. And the plan was that when after 6.9 was released, and that was definitely going to be the last dot release for the 6 series, the plan was I would merge all of that work into the main version of the program, and that we would bring out a release, as soon as possible after that. And it wouldn't be a very interesting release at all, because in theory, almost nothing was going to change. Hopefully it would solve a few bugs with MIDI notes. But the theory was that actually almost nothing should happen as far as users were concerned. We would just have changed the internal engineering of the software. And so that merge took place as kind of a traumatic process, but because I've been working on that other code for, I don't know, I mean, it was the second attempt at doing it, and I think I'd already spent many months working on it. And there was a previous attempt working on that back in 2017. So the merge was tricky, but in the end, things seemed to be working okay, and most stuff seemed to be functioning once it was done, and it just didn't really seem worth bringing out that as a release. It was really just not going to have anything for users that was new. We would just be waving our hands, all saying, "Oh, we're so much better inside," and users who ran into these weird cases where a MIDI note wouldn't play, they would have been happy. But everybody else would just have been, I don't get it. Why did they release Ardour 7? It seems exactly like Ardour 6.9. But we could have done that. That was the original plan. So instead, for some reason, I don't fully understand. Well, actually, no, I do fully understand it. I was really tired and bored with integrating all this work and time representation. It was just really tedious work. It was kind of fun to do the initial part of the architectural changes in the beginning, because it was quite difficult to come up with the designs that we needed or wanted or thought we needed or wanted. But it had gotten really boring after a lot of months. And after the merge appeared to be done, I was really looking around to find something fun to do that would be more interesting. And initially I went back to working on essentially a built-in plugin called the Beatbox, which is a step sequencer that you could use for programming grooves. Speaking of all the DAWs that are out there, the Beatbox was actually modeled a lot on the same feature in another DAW called MuLab, which I think more than 10 people have heard of, but it might only be 12. But you should check out MuLab step sequencer. It is a really amazing step sequencer, really great thing. So I worked on the Beatbox again for a little bit, and then it just didn't really feel like that was going anywhere either. And suddenly thought, I've been wanting to do clip launching the way that Ableton Live does for quite some time now. Let's just see how hard that could be. And so I just started, hacking up some code to try out the basic idea of, you press a button somewhere, or you press a key on a keyboard, and the program starts playing some piece of audio or some piece of MIDI that gets stretched to match the current tempo. And as usually happens with software development, within 3 weeks, I had 80% of the functionality. It was awesome. It's like, oh my God, we've just rewritten Ableton Live, and here we go. But of course, the regular truth of software development is this law that 80% of the development takes 20% of the time, and the last 20% takes 80% of the time. So starting back in, I guess starting somewhere in December or January, that's when the 20% that was left started to become the focus of my own development. And it was a lot of fun. This whole clip launching stuff, which we can talk about more or not, as we go along. It's a huge amount of fun to play with. I'm not as convinced as I was when I started that it's actually an incredibly great way to make music, but it's certainly a great way to play around with sounds and beats and grooves and stuff like that. So that was that feature bubbling up, is what has really pushed 7.0 out to the present day. Trying to get all of that stuff into good shape, fixing all the bugs that we discovered along the way with this time representation stuff, and then all the work that other people, notably Robin, have been doing in the meantime on a whole bunch of other features that have crept in over the last year. It's really added up to be it's going to be a pretty massive release in terms of new features, and in that sense pretty different than 6.0. Way more work, way more new features. 6.0, as I recall, was a lot more about bug fixes and some new features, but nothing as big as what we're doing in 7. So it was a bit of a long-winded way of answering that question, but it hopefully gives some idea of what went down.
Let me read another question. I lost it. Oh, I got it. Zelf Paul asks, what motivated you to commit to an open source model?
So my journey with open source began back in the 80s. I was a PhD student in Germany, working at an international research institute there. And one of the guys that helped to run the computing systems, a man called Neil Mansfield. I don't remember exactly how Neil got into it, but Neil had already discovered and knew about the GNU movement and knew about open source. And he taught to me, about that while I was there. I quit my PhD and moved back to England, coincidentally, to work at another job with Neil. He became my actual boss. And spent a year and a half mentoring me, and I feel eternally grateful to him for that. But along the way, he did a lot to impress upon me the ideas and ideals that were behind the open source movement. And he also tortured me with not answering questions as well when I would ask him things about TTY drivers, and he would just say, "You'll figure it out."
Have fun.
Which eventually I did, but it was like, God damn it, man, you know the answer. Could you just tell me the answer? Incredibly valuable. If you're entering people, don't answer their questions. So Neil was the person that introduced me to the GNU project, taught me to use Emacs, gave me some sense of the broader moral perspective on open source. And I then ended up working, I guess it was probably about another 10 years or so in and out of academia and business. Sometimes when I was in academic context, I'd be working on open source stuff. And in the business world, not so much, but we would be using open source tools because that's what programmers do, at least programmers who are using Unix systems. And so once I started, once I stopped being a professional programmer to raise my daughter, I don't know. I mean, to me, open source, it just seemed it was the obvious choice. It was the obvious choice from a moral and philosophical perspective, but it also seemed to me it was the correct choice from a pragmatic perspective too. I didn't know this back in the late 90s or the early 2000s, but hiring people to work on this kind of software is really, really difficult. I mean, there's very few people out there who are able to do this kind of work. And hiring them, why would they come and work for you in particular? It's crazy hard to do. If you go talk to the proprietary commercial companies, they have exactly the same story. It's very, very hard. And by creating an open source program for 22 years, I've had I/Ardour/the Ardour community have had contributions from a bunch of absolutely brilliant programmers, brilliant developers who've been willing to participate in this project. Maybe not as a job, maybe not for years and years or even decades and decades, but they've been willing to be a part of the project for a few months, a year, several years. And we've all benefited from their insight and brilliance and intelligence in ways that if this had been a closed source project wouldn't just never have happened. And so, even if you didn't believe in, that software ought to be free, that users should have the freedom to control their own software, to develop it, to redistribute it, even if you don't believe any of that stuff, if you just want to actually productively write audio software, making it open source means you're going to get way more contributions from people than you will do by having a closed source project. Now, I do happen to believe it in the philosophical side of it, so I'm very happy with how this has turned out. My moral feelings about software have aligned with the pragmatics of how are we going to write a major project like this without huge amounts of money and hiring a bunch of people. And it's been really good to experience that kind of alignment of philosophy and pragmatic outcome.
Yeah, so that kind of actually leads into, although I'm going to quickly interrupt with a random question from Lurking, wondering what's Paul's favorite Linux distro?
Oh, God.
I don't that's going to be a long answer. It doesn't have to
be. I don't have a favorite. When I started using Linux, I used Red Hat, but was not attached to it. I moved to Fedora, wasn't attached to it. And then, I don't know, about 8 years ago, I can't remember the exact reasons why, but I was looking around to maybe move to something else. And Robin Garius convinced me that I should use Debian. I've been using Debian for the last, 8 years. Do I really care? No, not really.
That's fair. But I just had to ask when I saw it. So then, Testing, I can't read that, is wondering if you have any tips for programmers who are starting to get into audio programming.
Well, one of the very first things that you must do is read a paper by Ross Benzina, Bencina, called something like Real Time Waits for No One. A Google search on Ross Benzina and Real Time will find it for you. This is absolutely mandatory reading for anyone who is doing this. It introduces a bunch of ideas that if you've written other kinds of software, possibly you hacked up an app on a phone, or you hacked a little spreadsheet thing to do a useful thing for you, you did some Python, Ross's paper will introduce you to the critical ideas that are at the heart of writing audio software. And if you don't know these, you'll go ahead and write audio software, but it won't work very well. And then secondly, don't write a DAW. You've seen how that turns out. I've just spent the last 22 years of my life doing it. We don't need another one. I'm sort of serious here, and I'm sort of joking, obviously. But we live in a world now where the capabilities of plugins are expanding slowly but progressively all the time, and it's very compelling to sit down and think, oh, I'm going to start my own DAW from scratch because it's so cool, and I'm going to be able to make it do this and do that. And it's true. And one of the reasons why there are lots of DAWs in the world is because it's hell of a lot of fun. I mean, the reason why I wake up each morning and I look forward to, coming in here and sitting down in front of a computer all day is that writing DAWs is freaking fantastic.
Paul, I think your cable came loose.
Oh, really? Hold on. Which one? Oh, you mean the Ethernet? Do you mean my network connection?
The mic one. I think it's better now. It was crackly.
Okay.
It's good.
Okay, sorry.
Carry on.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's really fun to work on a DAW. But if you set out to write your own one, your own complete standalone application that will do all the stuff that you want from audio, it's only my opinion, but I think you're wasting your time and you're wasting the time of people that your software might be useful for. You know, there is a halfway house. There was a pretty cool non-open source project that popped up last month called Beat Scholar, which is an amazing plugin for doing drum programming. It works as a plugin and a standalone application. But those guys still wisely resisted the temptation to actually write a DAW. They said, okay, we're going to write something that just does this, and we're going to keep it fairly contained. And I'm on their Discord channel, and they're getting hammered all the time by people saying, could you add this? Could you add that? You know, and you can see the writing on the wall, which is that a lot of their users want the standalone version to turn into a DAW. And I know why the users want that, but as a programmer, if you go down that path, you're just going to be reinventing so much stuff that has been invented previously. So if there's any way for you to find a place for your vision as an audio programmer by staying in the sort of plugin world, everyone benefits from that. You won't need to reinvent the wheel that I reinvented, and the guy that wrote StudioOne reinvented, and the guy that wrote Bitwig reinvented, and so on. And you'll be able to produce something that's useful to way more people. Okay, we had a question earlier, why use Ardour versus StudioOne? Well, how about the users of your software don't have to make that choice? How about you write a plugin that they can use in Ardour or StudioOne? So all of those things, and get more sleep than I did when I started working on Ardour. That's the other piece of advice I give.
I guess people are now going to ask about Zrythm. Yeah, they are typing Zrythm.
Have you
heard about
Zrythm? Yes, I do know about Zrythm, and Alex and I have chatted on IRC on and off over the years that he's worked on it. I'm happy to see that he's getting close to a release. I still think that the effort and ingenuity and invention that he's put into it would have been, as far as users are concerned, it would have been better for people if he'd have put all that into Ardour. But then I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yeah, I also think that this is kind of the nature of the open source community or mindset, that people like to have options, and lots of people like to just make things by their own, even if they already exist. So, and maybe that's as you said, maybe that is a waste of time if you look at it objectively, but for them subjectively it's a journey, and possibly a very important one.
Absolutely.
So
no, I absolutely agree with that, and that's why I said that, you know, in some ways I was joking when I say things like, you know, don't write a DAW. I just think people sometimes need to be reminded of the fact that when you start down that, if you start down that kind of path, you're going down a path that many other people have gone down, and all depends on what your reasons for going down that path are, right? I mean, if you want to just learn how to be a better audio programmer, then you should probably just try to do whatever you're thinking about and see if you can make it work. If you're thinking about it with more of a perspective on, you know, what could I do that would be a really great thing for other people to use when they're doing a certain kind of work, then maybe don't go down that path. Maybe think a little bit more about a framework and a context in which to do some really cool and useful stuff for people that does not involve in you reinventing the wheel again. And I would stress that, you know, one of the reasons that I wrote Ardour in the first place, I mean, this is a sort of secondary answer to the question of why was it open source in the first place. You know, when I started working on Ardour, if you wanted to write a web browser or a text editor, I think at that point, you know, we even had GIMP for audio editing. There were plenty of other photo editing software. There was some drawing software. You could go find an example of how to do that. If you didn't know how text editors work, you could go read the source code of a whole bunch of text editors, and you could learn how they do their stuff. And if you wanted to then go on and do your own, great, you could do that. But when you came to the DAW world, there was nothing to learn from, right? I mentioned earlier the S&D program, amazing audio file editor, not a DAW, not a real-time audio tool. There weren't any examples of anything floating around that a user could go, sorry, not a user really, that an audio programmer could look at and say, well, I wonder how you do this in a DAW. You know, I wonder what types of data structures you use for that. I wonder what approach you use for that. And I had the goal then, and I still have the goal now, that, you know, even if Ardour is a bunch of crap, which some people think it is, even if there's no reason to use it in preference to any other DAW, it still stands right now as a big blob of code that other developers, including Alex and some others, can go look at and say, well, how did they do that in Ardour? And they might turn around, having seen that, and said, oh my God, these people are morons, right? I mean, what are they doing? This is terrible code. It's a stupid design. Why did you do that? And that's fine. My goal wasn't, you know, I didn't think I would be able to get everything right. I just thought it would be a great idea for there to be an example of how you do this stuff. And there were no examples, and now there is. And so if that leads people to go off that, you know, on their own garden path towards this thing that they want to do, if Ardour can help them in that, then that's great. It really is. So.
John, you've got a questions?
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, I thought it was your turn. So, a quick question should be pretty quick. Is what engine components of Ardour are written in assembly? I know you answered that to me the other day.
It's just really a few very small pieces of code. We discovered back in the late 2000s that metering, that is to say, looking at every sample that goes through the program and seeing if it's the largest or smallest, or maybe it's just if it's the largest value that's gone down a particular signal pathway, was consuming by far the most CPU power of anything that Ardour does. You have to remember that Ardour doesn't have any built-in processing of its own. It certainly didn't at that point. It maybe has a couple of things that could be counted as that now, but it had none at that point. And the metering was really burning the CPU for us. And so a wonderful Finnish program, Savolainen, dedicated himself to the task of cooking up handwritten assembler to optimize all that code. And at that point, if you were running with a fairly large buffer size, like 1,024 samples, his code cut 30% of the DSP load of running Ardour. Since that time, we've slightly expanded the set of things that we did with assembler. There's a couple of other specialized functions that apply a gain level to a buffer, and I think a couple of other functions too. But also in the meantime, we discovered that compilers have gotten much better, and the last round of improvements that we made to that code, which was I think earlier this year, possibly last year, that actually we can't do that much better anymore than the compilers can. So although we still have assembler in place for doing metering, some gain applications, stuff like that, the actual benefits from it have really gone down from where they would have been 10 years ago.
All right, let me read a question from chat. Eduardas J asks, what MIDI workflow changes you definitely would like to implement in the future?
Well, so what this is, let's see, what's the best way to go about answering this question? For the people that don't know Ardour, and I know that there's a few people watching today who are not that familiar with it, one of the relatively unique characteristics in the program is the fact that we do not have a separate piano roll window for working with MIDI. We're not totally unique about that. Pro Tools also offers the same kind of workflow that we do. One of my favorite musicians is a huge fan of that workflow. But there's an awful lot of other people who really have a strong attachment to the idea that when you're doing MIDI editing, somehow on the window there should be this thing that pops up or emerges somewhere that is a dedicated panel for doing MIDI editing. this is one of the two big things that people complain about with our MIDI editing. Where is the piano roll? And when we tell them, oh, it's right in the track, you don't need a separate window, a lot of people are not convinced by this, including our host today, I believe. I'm not totally certain. And then the second thing that really bugs people is that we do not have a bunch of velocity lollipops, which are these little vertical sticks with balls on top of them that show you what the velocity of the notes are laid out along some horizontal line and let you move them up and down to control velocity.
Oh, yes.
This is another feature that lots of people basically say, like, well, I just can't use this program for MIDI because you don't have velocity lollipops. As we said earlier, these are the kinds of things that are very much affected by what software you've learned to use and precisely what your workflow is. There are people who work with MIDI who hardly ever change the velocity of anything. There are people for whom it's very important to be able to control velocity, actually even more than you can with lollipops. People who, for example, want modulation sources from somewhere else or nice curves. So the question is, for these two features in particular, do we have any plans in the future? My own personal take is you don't need a goddamn MIDI piano roll, and I'm not going to work to give it to you. However, it does turn out that for a completely different reason, which is to do with the clip stuff that we've done, there actually is a use case for a piano roll type editor. Anybody who knows Ableton Live or has messed around with the pre-release version of Ardour 7 will know that when you're on our cues page or live session view page and you have all the clips in there, you can click on one and there's a bunch of boxes down at the bottom that let you do stuff to the clips. And one of them is a little editor that will let you change what's in a MIDI clip or change the length of it and so on. And so we now have a new place in the program where you kind of need a window that would let you edit MIDI, or at the very least change the boundaries of it, but probably edit it too.
Paul,
as a result, yes.
Would you like to show this around? Demonstrate it in Ardour 7 RC1?
Not really, because the thing I'm talking about doesn't actually exist.
All right.
So you'd be pointing at a blank space and saying, this is what should go here.
To
do. But anyway, that clip launching stuff has generated a new and independent reason why we should be able to pop up some sort of area that you can do this kind of stuff in. And so for those fans of a separate piano roll window, there is hope. I'm not telling you when it's going to happen. I'm not even telling you that it is going to happen, but there will probably be work that will lead to this happening. On the velocity lollipops, everybody who wants these writes the worst chords, or they don't use chords, since the velocity lollipops are horrible for manipulating their velocity of chords, because you need to typically edit all of them at once, or it's tricky to, anyway. I'm not sure what we're going to do about velocity lollipops. There is a bug report, or at least one of them, about this in our bug tracker, and somebody has made a really good suggestion that actually convinced me. I don't remember what it is right now, but at some point after this release is done, I'll go back and read the bug report again. And there is an idea in there for how to do this. I would stress that the main reason we haven't done it is not, I mean, doing stuff like this in the user interface is always complicated. But it really has been to do with the fact that I had this standing objection, which is like, how are you going to deal with chords? And until I got until I got a viable answer to that question, I was not willing to even think about doing it. We do have a somewhat viable suggestion now, and I suspect that at some point in the future, we will implement something along those lines. In the meantime, I'd like to point out to you that there is a little velocity bar in every single note drawn in Ardour now. And you can just go there and click on it, and you can change the velocity of that note right where the note is, not down at the bottom and try to line up exactly which lollipop is which note and so on. Or you shouldn't have to do that because it would be selected and you could see it. But anyway, it's not hard to change velocities now in the program. It's just that you don't do it in the way that people think works better for their workflow. And I suspect that at some point in the future, now that we have a good suggestion for chords, we will do something about that. In the meantime, in version 7, there's been a bunch of other almost trivial changes that I personally think add up to a somewhat enhanced workflow for MIDI. As I said, a lot of them are really trivial stuff to do with how note selection works, providing the ability to scroll around in the note ranges, providing ways to explicitly control what note lengths, channels, and velocities you're using. There's just been a recent fairly major change by Robin that allows MIDI regions to be opaque. That has not been true in our software previously. In Ardour, you're allowed to layer regions on top of each other, which is something that most other DAWs do not do. And with audio, you've always had the choice of, when you put one region on top of the other one, can you hear the one underneath it? And most people I shouldn't say obviously, most people want the top one to be opaque, which is, if I put this region over this region, I don't want to hear the one underneath it. That has not been true for MIDI. They were always transparent. And so if you layered one MIDI region over another, you would hear both layers. It's now possible to make that choice, and you can have an opaque MIDI region. We've also added a combine operation for MIDI regions, which a lot of people have been wanting. It's not something you couldn't do before, but it's a much simpler way. If you've got 3 different MIDI regions with a bunch of stuff you like in them, and you want to combine them into one, that's now a trivial operation. So there's a bunch of small changes that we've made. Another example of what I mean. If you transpose notes, now the track will shift the note range that it's looking at so that you don't lose the notes. It's a small thing, but if you transpose stuff all the time, it's super annoying that you transpose them and where are the notes gone? They've just vanished. They went off the bottom, or they went off the top. So I'm hoping that people who work on MIDI a lot will find themselves appreciating a lot of these little tweaks. And for those people who are real separate piano roll and velocity lollipop freaks, we'll have something for you coming down the pipeline later.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I've come to like having the inline editor in certain ways because it helps you see where you're editing relative to what's going on in the track instead of just being at the bottom. So it can help like writing a bass line to line up with chords. So
yeah.
Let's see here. So that's a good... Where's the question I was looking for? It is right here. Daniel Murray asks, any possibility of a mix template for Ardour that is like Mixbus 32 without doing it yourself?
I don't know. I think that's a thing that you should probably turn to our community on our forums and ask about. There's certainly no reason why you couldn't do something quite close to that in Ardour. You'd have to pick the plugins carefully. You won't be able to get exactly the same interconnection routing that Mixbus has, since that routing is internal. The other big feature of Mixbus is not just the signal processing, but the fact that you've actually got knobs for all of the built-in processing right there on the screen. But on the other hand, now that we have inline plugin controls that you can choose to display, you could do some version of that too. It's not something that I think those of us who are involved in Ardour development would likely do, but it's possible that if you ask on the forums that you could generate some interest and some insight and expertise and actually come up with some kind of a template for that.
I wonder, there is this extension to LV2 plugin format that I believe you and Robin developed, the inline displays.
Just Robin.
Just
yeah,
Robin.
just Robin. Yeah.
Yeah, so these are non-interactive, but maybe it would make sense to allow interaction for them, and then one could implement like a mixer strip using the inline display. So we have like an embedded little GUI for a plugin right in the mixer strip.
Yeah, I mean, you could right now you can combine the displays with the inline bar controls to control a specific parameter. So you can have so you could have a display of, say, a parametric EQ, and then you could have knobs for each band, and that would eliminate the need to actually interact directly with the parametric display. But I also appreciate that quite a lot of people like that, like having a little parametric curve that you could tweak. I would question the utility of it when the amount of screen real estate is so small. I think probably just adding doing the thing you can already do, which is to say, I want to bring up the knee control for my compressor and put it directly in line in the mixer strip. That's something you can do right now. And as long as you've got plugins that don't have too many parameters that you really need to control, it will be quite easy to put those all in line in the mixer strip and have instant access to all of them.
I guess the issue then would be that to expose these, you would need to do it individually for every single instance of the plugin. There is no way to copy and paste the plugin with the settings for which parameters are displayed in.
I don't know. Robin would know the answer to that for sure. I don't know where to copy and paste. Copy and paste might carry that over, but I'm not certain. But I would certainly say that it sounds like that's a thing you'd want to be able to do with that feature.
Let me bring another question from the chat. Spyros Theodoridis, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asks, do all popular DAWs, including Ardour, provide the same audio recording / playback quality, given all else equal?
This is a little bit of a contentious topic, because there are people out there who make claims about what DAWs do internally and whether they have better sound and so on. At some fundamental level, all DAWs that I know of on the market today have a state they can be in where almost every bit in corresponds to the bit that you get out, and they're the same bit or the same value, if you like. And so essentially they're capable of completely transparent audio playback. Whatever files you tell them to use, or whatever audio they have passing through them directly from the audio interface, is going to be pretty much exactly what you hear on the other side. That being said, there are some DAWs where there is some evidence that they do actually, unless you disable it explicitly, they do actually do a little bit of processing on their own, but I wouldn't say by default, but I suppose that by default is a reasonable way to put it. Some of them do have things in the signal processing chain that mean that they are actually changing the signal a little bit. Obviously, they do that because they think it's for the best. Some users will like that they do that, and some don't. Now, an extreme case version of this would be something like Mixbus, Harrison Mixbus, which is based on Ardour. And, Mixbus makes a very particular point of saying the sound you get out is not exactly what it pulls off of the disc or what you get in from your audio interface. And that's a feature rather than a bug, because that's the point of it, is to emulate what would happen when you put it through a traditional console, and there would be some compression and some limiting and various other things going on. But all I believe that all the DAWs that are around, you can't. There are ways to turn off any of that kind of hidden implicit processing. The only exception to that is that some DAWs, including Ardour, have at least the option to apply. Well, I just did it back so you can turn this off. The one thing that Ardour does that prevents it from being bit for bit perfect playback by default is we apply tiny little fades at the beginning and ends of regions. So if you were literally doing a null comparison, if you were taking a piece of if you took an audio file and you put it into a region in Ardour, and then you start the transport roll and you play it. If you null it, you'll notice that at the beginning and end of the region, it doesn't quite null. But once again, that's a feature that you can turn off if you don't want that there. So yeah, I would say in general, all of them really provide the same quality playback, because I would consider the same quality playback to be, we don't touch the audio at all. That to me it is the definition of what the DAW should be doing. If you want it to sound different, if you want an EQ, or you want a compressor, or you want, some tube warmth or something else in the sound, then go ahead and add a plugin. That's what the plugins are for, and that's where you should get that stuff from. The DAW should be capable of giving you exactly the output that it had as its input, and I believe all the DAWs on the market right now have a way to do that, although you may have to turn off a couple of settings to actually get that.
So we've actually had 2 people ask, I believe, but what is your opinion on Pipewire? And I'm going to extend that with, what is Ardour going to properly support the Pipewire backend, or just continue to use its Jack implementation? And I know you'll say so, but I know you suggest ALSA as the Linux backend.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm very happy that Wim Taman started the Pipewire project. I think it's a very exciting development for Linux audio. And I think it's really just great that it's gotten, in a relatively short period of time, as far as it has. For those who don't know what Pipewire is, just to clarify, if you use audio on Linux right now, you're confronted essentially with the lowest level of audio I/O on Linux, which is ALSA, which is the kernel provided drivers. And then you've got a choice after that of whether you use, or whether the software uses Pulse Audio, which is a sort of consumer desktop oriented audio system. Lets you do a bunch of cool things that you probably don't want to do, but they're cool anyway. Or using Jack, which is targeting more pro audio and music creation workflows. And both of these two things, Pulse Audio is, people complain about Pulse Audio, but I think the Pulse Audio is actually pretty great at what it does. And Jack is pretty great at what it does. The difficulty is lots of people run into collisions between them. They, for example, want to work in Ardour on Linux, and they want to watch a YouTube video at the same time that they're working on their session, because the YouTube video has something that they want to replicate or something in a session, and they find that they can't do it because their browser is probably using Pulse Audio and Ardour is using Jack, for example, or the ALSA backend. And so it's quite frustrating for a lot of people. And unfortunately, as always happens with this, it's most frustrating for the beginner users who really deserve a much smoother early experience on Linux. But even for the experienced users, it can be a pain. And Pipewire is here to really fix all that by integrating what Pulse Audio does, integrating what Jack does into a single API and audio system for Linux. And I think that I think this is going to be just great. It's really a fantastic idea, and it will put us in an even better situation than either Windows or Mac OS on Linux too. I mean, we will have features that people can just use out of the box that are better than anything you can get on those other operating systems.
Yes.
That said, yeah, absolutely. That said, Pipewire is not quite ready for use on the pro audio side of things yet. They're making rapid progress. They respond rapidly and excellently to useful bug reports. But most of the people that I'm watching who are using it as a substitute for Jack are running into little details of parts of the Jack API that they haven't implemented yet. I have absolutely no doubt that they will implement them in time. And when they do, and when enough of you poor people who volunteered to test it out early say that it's working just fine, then we'll, our public position on Pipewire will just be, yeah, of course you should use it. I mean, it's what's there on Linux. We're not quite there yet, and I don't know how long it will be from now until when Pipewire does all the things it needs to do on the pro audio side. Certainly for the consumer and desktop side of things, I think it's already better than Pulse Audio. So it's a good system. Will we use it directly in Ardour? It's hard to answer that. I always said we'd never provide a Pulse Audio backend. And then Robin, I think he was on a train going somewhere, and he decided to implement a playback only Pulse Audio backend. It is kind of useful in some scenarios, especially if you just want to do playback, if you're just editing, for example. So I'd never say never. I don't think we have any plans for it right now. I personally feel that Linux audio world is better served. Really, well, I don't know. I'm not sure what my position is on this. I don't really want to see another API like the Pipewire API start becoming one of the standard ways that applications write their audio I/O stuff. I feel that would be a mistake. I think we've got ALSA in place already. If that doesn't suit your purpose, then it's a little bit more it's a bit more tricky to decide what you should do. What library do you use to make it easy? If you're doing pro audio stuff, you should almost certainly be using Jack, just because it's the right API and it'll make sure that you design things in the right way. But there is that gray zone, for somebody who is doing something and they really don't want to use ALSA because it's too low level and they can't grapple with it. What are they going to use? I mean, realistically, in a few years, they're probably going to end up using Pipewire. And so we will end up in a scenario where it is a new API. At that point, will we add support for it in Ardour? I don't know. I mean, there don't seem to be very many benefits of doing so, but we might do it anyway.
Have you had any particular issues with Pipewire as of late, or have you heard any user stories? Because I've been using it for a quarter, maybe half a year now, for normal desktop stuff and for audio production with Ardour and other tools. And all the issues I had have been fixed.
So I don't use Pipewire at all. I mostly just sit and watch other people use it and smile quietly to myself. But I believe there are still issues with its latency reporting stuff. It does not get that correct at this point, which means that if you're doing things with Ardour in which latency for the signal paths matter, you will get things that are either misaligned or otherwise incorrectly aligned if you're using Pipewire. However, for a lot of scenarios, if you're literally just doing in the box production with Ardour, it's going to just work. These sorts of things only start showing up when you start doing more complicated routing. Yes, and then you'll see that blinking red no align button just because the information could be incorrect, for example. So, I think most of the issues with it are in the little corners of the Jack API at this point. I saw Robin noted in the chat that recording overdubs with Pipewire, they will not align right now. So, stuff to do with their latency reporting needs to be tidied up. And there's a couple of other little corners of the whole Jack API that they need to improve a little bit. It'll certainly work for, if you're doing stuff almost entirely in the box and don't have crazy routing stuff happening, then it'll just work. And as I said earlier, I want to stress the positive side rather than the negative side. I mean, Pipewire really does represent a much brighter future for audio on Linux. I've been doing things on Linux for long enough now. My system is set up that I can have my browser running and Ardour running and other Jack applications and other Pulse audio applications. Everything just works. But I'm really aware of the fact that when I try to explain to anybody how this works, it's really hard to to explain how to get this set up and make it work reliably. And even doing this live stream today to actually get my nice microphone to be feeding into the video web-based system that you're all looking at. I mean, I didn't have to hand over any of my children or anything, but it wasn't a trivial task to get that working. So I think, you know, the maturation of Pipewire and its adoption everywhere is going to be really fantastic for audio on Linux.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, the only thing I've seen is I think it was with making routing, what are those called? Inserts. I had some inserts wouldn't connect to other inserts using the Jack API, and I had to switch back to ALSA for a crazy project I was working on. But the routing on that project's insane. So yeah, makes sense. I think it works in normal Jack. I don't remember if I tested, but yeah, but for the most part, I've been using Pipewire full time on all my systems, and it's been great. So let's see here. I think Umfa, do you have a question?
I can read a question.
Yep.
Burhim Youssef asks, hello, I have always found it so hard to work with my local sounds, something like a media manager as a side panel instead of a standalone window. Thank you.
We have made steps in this direction, which you'll see in Ardour 7. Probably not enough steps for the questioner or anybody else, but some steps in that direction. I want to outline, first of all, why we're not that convinced we want to go too far down this path. If you look at a really good sample library application, and on Linux, the obvious tool for that is SampleCat. SampleCat has a bunch of, has a lot of features in it. It's a full-blown application for managing your sample libraries. It's not just a list or a tree view or some other relatively sort of simple presentation of here's a bunch of files. It lets you do things like renaming files. It lets you move them around. It lets you copy them. It lets you copy parts of them. It lets you change the metadata associated with files. I think it lets you recode them. It's a really fully blown, extremely useful tool. Assuming that it works, which apparently some people think that it doesn't. But there were versions of it that worked. Maybe it's bit rotted in just a few years. But even if it doesn't work today, it represented what a fully blown sample library manager should look like. And, frankly, the idea of building all of that into Ardour, it really goes against a little bit of the philosophy that we tend to have with the program. For a long time, we did not bother to, well, actually, we never have done, for example, CD burning. I know nobody burns CDs anymore, but back in the 2000s, when people wanted to burn CDs from their DAW, and some of the proprietary DAWs would let you do this, we just said, look, burning CDs is an operation with loads of different parameters and options and choices that you might want to make. And we don't really want to re-implement a whole well-designed user interface for doing this when there are dedicated programs to do that. So we'll help you try to integrate with those other programs, but we're not going to re-implement that ourselves. And sample library management is sort of an example of something. Oh dear. Sorry, I just heard a noise outside of my house. That's very bad news for me. Okay.
Got to grab your shotgun.
No, just a piece of building material that has just been broken by the wind. Anyway, let me get back to the point. Yeah, so we have a little bit of reluctance against trying to build all the sophistication of something like SampleCat into Ardour. And to be honest, I think if I was going to do this, that's what I would want to do. I don't want like a totally half-baked thing for this. So having said all that about why you won't do it, version 7, there is a new panel that's a part of the, it's not a standalone window. It's part of the editor lists area, which is over on the right-hand side if you're showing it. And if you're not showing it, it's up in View, Show Editor Lists.
Clips.
And this is our first step towards allowing you to structure your own sample libraries and go and find things in there. It doesn't do a whole lot right now, but it does provide some limited sense of organizing things by directories. So we leave that for you to do in your system file manager. We leave the renaming in your system file manager, but you can at least see some kind of a structure inside of Ardour.
Nice.
That if you know how to use your file manager, you'll be able to actually get a very useful and coherent presentation in that list. So there are steps in that direction. I would imagine that over the next year or plus, you'll see additional improvements being made to that particular list panel with new features, new capabilities, stuff like that. I do not think it is going to evolve all the way into SampleCat. I doubt if it will even evolve into the capabilities that some of the DAWs offer, because they have got, some of them have gone a long way down that path. But for working with the clip manager, for working with clip launching, you know, my experience has been it gives you 70% of what you want right now.
Oh, go ahead. This reminds me a little bit of the situation with Blender, the open source 3D creation toolkit or package, maybe. They had their own game engine, and now there wasn't something like Godot game engine that is coming up now, and it's like actually competitive with other proprietary game engines out there, starting to become competitive. So it also, I always felt that it was a great idea that they axed the game engine in Blender, because it was a wasted effort. There are better game engines that are separate and are also open source and are great. So it would be better to work on integrating with them rather than waste your time reinventing the wheel and just spending your resources on something that isn't really needed and never going to be as good as a dedicated tool.
Yeah, that's a direction we generally like to go in. I have to say that there have been times in the past where that's been the philosophical position, and then we go look at the standalone tools, and you're like, yeah, you know what, we could do this better, and then we end up redoing it ourselves. But you know, if SampleCat really is broken at this point, it would be a really awesome thing for an audio developer to come along and, or even not an audio developer, but somebody to come along and sort of work on fixing the features of that, just because that was a program that had a lot of promise for that kind of work.
Yeah, there's another one called Sample. Oh, I muted my mic. There's another one called Sample Hive too that I think unfa probably knows a bit more about. I forget who's developing it, but yeah, I think that's a fair point, that you don't need. If you don't need to do it, if someone else can provide it, then it's probably better to let them handle it and keep working on what you're focused on, you know?
Yeah.
So let's see here. Where was I? Had one more question. Oh yeah. Ronnie asks, are there any new plugins added by the Ardour team in Ardour 7?
No.
That's a quick answer. So that
moving on.
Yeah, right. Oh, here we go. Pyrox asks, is elastic audio for timing corrections on the horizon for Ardour?
It is definitely on the horizons now. So internally, one of the big aspects of doing clip launching is the idea that all the clips that you play are going to be playing at the tempo in the session at that point. And so although we've had a time stretching tool in Ardour for many, many years, so that you could stretch a region or shrink it, and it would, you know, maintain the correct pitch while changing tempo. With the clip launching stuff, we now are actually doing that in real time. If you launch an audio clip that's at 134 BPM, but the session's at 72 BPM, we're time stretching it to make it fit the tempo. As a result, you know, I've had substantially more experience than I have ever had in the past with using Rubber Band, which is the library we use for doing this stuff. And it's relatively clear to me how we would do this for stuff on the timeline in the future. I think it will also allow us to start doing things like warp, what some people call warp editing, for example, where you can go in and take a region and say, okay, I want to stretch this, but this beat and this point here, they all need to stay at the same times or the same relative distances from each other and so on. So you get sort of a generalized stretch, but it's not just a uniform stretch. The way to do stuff like that is now relatively obvious as well. So I think that we will probably be adding a lot more things in that area. However, if you're literally just doing timing corrections, then it depends a lot exactly on what you mean. So, for example, if you're trying to, if you have a drum track and the drummer is, he hit the hi-hat too early, you can use warp editing to adjust that. So if and when we get there, that would be a tool. I'm not sure that our workflow for that is going to be as friendly as some of the other proprietary DAWs, partly because I have a philosophical attachment to saying you should tell the drummer to play it again. And
not quite my tempo.
Yeah. Or, well, it was the right tempo, but you hit the hi-hat too early, or, can you bring it back? I have very mixed feelings about some of the stuff that the technology we've seen emerging in the last 15 years in this niche that many of us work and live in. To take a tool like Melodyne, I mean, it's not open source. It's an incredibly powerful tool for manipulating audio. You can take polyphonic parts and separate them by note and restructure chords with the sound of somebody singing and make them sing a different chord, and it actually sounds really quite good. And I think with all of these tools, there are creative purposes that they can be put to, but there's also the thing they tend to get touted for more than anything, which is fixing stuff that somebody didn't get right. And I know that my own personal philosophy tends to be, the creative side of this seems interesting, but the bit you didn't get right I understand why time is money and you just want the audio engineer to fix it in the studio. But I would personally prefer that you just go and improve what you did in the first place. I don't really want to spend my time. I think most of the other people who have worked on Ardour over the years are not super interested in spending their time working on things to fix the mistakes that people are making when they try to perform. There's a lot of money in doing that, obviously, because, commercial recording studios and, commercial music production benefits an awful lot from not having to have people come back into the studio and do another take. It's just not an area that I'm super interested in providing incredibly good workflows for. But I think over the next year or two, you will see the emergence of some new features that use elastic time in ways that will make some of that kind of thing a little easier to do.
I would like to add to that because my experience with using, making music, is that I had the same idea that I should just, if I recorded a bad part, I should just record it again and again until I get it right. So for the longest time, on all of my existing albums, which there are 5 long plays, and there are some vocal songs, there is no pitch correction at all, because I just re-recorded as long as I had to get a usable take. And some of them aren't perfect anyway. But when my life changed a lot and I have much less time to actually do this, I just have no way of re-recording my takes over and over, or spending 3 days to just rehearse my vocals to record them perfectly. So tools like that could actually help amateurs as well to get usable results from very limited resources that they have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this goes back, if I can just speak now to a even bigger philosophical point, and it's one that I struggle with. Struggle is too strong of a word, but it's a thing that I've thought about a lot over 20 plus years of writing audio software. And the way I like to frame it is, one of my favorite composers is the American minimalist Steve Reich. And I think about Reich being a young man in New York City in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and creating essentially a new style of music. And because Reich had connections with some music academies in New York City, and because he lived in New York City, he had lots of connections to people, and he could form ensembles that could come and play his music, even if that meant playing this repeating 16th note riff for an hour and gradually shifting by a 16th note every 8 bars. He could find people to come and do that, and he could just therefore hear what his musical ideas sounded like. And if Reich had grown up in a small town in Kansas City or in Eastern Poland or in, I don't know, many parts of the African continent, and most parts of the world, in fact, other than New York City, this option is not available, right? You don't have your network of experimental music friends and people with basement studios and lofts to try all the stuff out in, or friendships with the local piano music store where you can go in and actually use 6 pianos at once to rehearse your piece. And all the technology that is connected with Ardour, all the DAWs and the plugins and everything that we've seen emerge over the last 25 to 30 years now mean that person who is much more isolated, is not part of a large, thriving live musical culture, is now able to realize a bunch of their musical ideas. And in many ways, that just seems awesome. I mean, it's fabulous. It's, expanding human creativity and expanding the reach of what a person who, through no fault of their own, or maybe their own preferences, just cannot utilize other people in that way, and instead they're now able to use computers. And so on the one hand, I think that's pretty awesome that the software and the technology is allowing the potential for another Steve Reich, whatever your particular preference might be, to come along and do their own experiments with music and with composition and that whole thing without needing to be in a particular kind of place. But at the same time, I also have a fairly strong conviction that most of the music from many different traditions and cultures around the world that I consider to be really great seems to support the idea that music is really a social activity, and that humans have been involved in it as a social activity for centuries or millennia. And I am a little troubled by the way in which the technology that I helped to create is making it less of a social activity and more of an individual activity. And although I think that can be great, because I've sat here in this very room, making my own stuff with VCV Rack, and it's a very enjoyable experience. And I don't want to have to go out and find other people who can make a noise like the basal module in Rack. I want to just use the basal module in the Rack, and it's going to do exactly what I tell it to. But I do have some doubts and unease about the way in which, as we continually push the technology towards, unfa doesn't need to actually either improve his singing or find, a friend or somebody in his neighborhood who can sing. He can just do pitch correction and everything sounds great.
Or I can shut the fuck up.
Yeah, or you can shut the fuck up. On the one hand, being able to do that technological stuff seems awesome for, in this case, for unfa's creativity, and by extension for many other people's creativity. I just don't know what that does for the social aspect of music more broadly. And I worry that that's a very important component of most musical cultures that we don't really want to lose. I'm done.
Yeah. I kind of want to add to that, but I think we'll just get way too deep into a philosophical discussion on music and completely lose sight of Ardour. So instead, I'll just mention, as a someone deep into sound design and electronic music, being able to warp samples in a creative way is helpful beyond just pitch correction. Since I can, for example, take a drum loop that's traditionally straight and swing it, because, you know, I'm not a drummer, I don't own a drum kit. I can't just go, and as you're saying, oh, guess I have a gating issue. But as you're saying, the social aspect there, hopefully that's better. The social aspect of it is definitely lost in not finding a drummer, but it also means that if I just want a drum beat, I can take anyone, I can change, maybe I can offset the kick using the editor and get a different feel to it instantly, instead of having to, maybe I can use the same loop for the entire song and shift it around 5 times. So I think there is merit to having this in there in a creative right. But I do see what you're saying in that it encourages you to not be good at your instrument.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely, I agree with all the possibilities that it opens up. And I think sometimes even literally just straight musical ones, as opposed to, like, you know, interesting sound design things. I mean, one thing that I remember was a really profound moment, and this is not really to do with time stretching the way that, you know, with elastic time and rubber band and stuff like that. There was there's a VCV rack, what can you call him? YouTuber, instructor, person, wonderful guy, Omri Cohen, has a great YouTube channel. If you want to learn how to use VCV rack, Omri is the guy. And he was doing a live stream and had cooked up this, you know, there's a pretty great piece that was running at, I don't know, knowing Omri is probably around 110 BPM. And, you know, it was, it's quite rhythmic and structured, and I wouldn't exactly say funky, but really, really pushing the beat and the groove. And he sort of finished working on it. And at some point, the question came up, you know, what happens if we change the tempo? And he put out a call to say, like, okay, so what tempo should we try? And people were throwing out, oh, like 120 or 85. And somebody at some point just said 33, which seemed kind of absurd, right? Because it's slowing it down so much. Now, of course, there's no audio artifacts problem with doing it in rack like this. You're just changing the clock speed. And he slowed it down to 33. And everyone who was watching that live stream, including me and including Omri, everybody just sat back and we were just like, wow, what the hell? Like, it was a completely new piece of music with new timbres and new nuances, even though everything was happening. It was all just rack. It was all just pretty much not completely deterministic, but mostly. And it was astounding. And that was just from, you know, a simple tempo change. And I know when I've been playing with clips while I've been working on Ardour 7, you know, the difference when you load in, you know, a fairly upbeat, funky African drum beat and you slow it down significantly, it has a totally different kind of a feel to it. And so I definitely feel that, you know, this ability to manipulate things and mess around with them and transform them in ways that, yeah, maybe it is undermining the fact you didn't bring the drummer back in and say, hey, could you try playing it much slower? Yeah, it's undermining that, but it's also opening up so many possibilities for people that just otherwise wouldn't be there, because they wouldn't ask the drummer back. They don't even know the drummer, you know.
And not to mention, then you can try it at all your different speeds, determine which speed you like the best, and then call your drummer back in afterwards to come and record as well, if you wanted to go that route, which I do know a few musicians who do that. So that's not an uncommon workflow. But yeah, it's funny. The whole slowing it down thing is pretty much that's what the vaporwave producers, quote unquote, discovered, is that if you just take a popular song, you slow it down 20%, and they just do it with pitch shifting. So it's just the whole thing's pitched down, slowed down, and it's a whole different experience. So yeah, it's pretty crazy how much that works.
It's just like speed adjustment. There is no pitch correction, right? No resampling. It's just slowing it down. So it also,
exactly.
The notes and the tuning, everything just.
And there are also other examples I could give. You know, one one that I like. Again, not accessible to most people, and depending on the style of music you're making, completely not relevant at all. But there's a progressive rock band, Porcupine Tree, and they did an album where all the drum was done on drum machines, and relatively sophisticated drum programming. I mean, it was prog rock; it wasn't 4 to the floor house or something. But the leader of that band wasn't ever really super satisfied with the way that the drum sounded on that album. And in the end, he brought in a live drummer and let him listen to it for a long time. And they re-recorded the whole album with the live drummer essentially playing the same stuff, but free to do his own fills and his own feel to it. And everyone thought the result was way better. Now, I'm sure there are a few examples in musical history where it's gone the other direction too. So, I don't want to suggest there's hard lines here that all music needs to happen by people getting together and playing instruments together and being in the same room. I just also don't want us to lose that element of what making music has always been about in our species. And at this point, we should probably move on to another question. And I've got one I'd like to answer, actually, if I can just jump in here.
Go ahead.
So Skyhawk77 says, has Paul Davis considered working for another DAW developer like PreSonus, who can use his programming skills in DAW development? So some more personal background history here. Well, yeah, I have considered working not so much for PreSonus, but with them, because before they developed StudioOne, they were trying to decide what to do. And they did actually meet with the head of PreSonus because they were considering adopting Ardour as the DAW that they would go with. Obviously, as time has told us, they did not decide to do that. And in fact, they hired the guy that had written Cubase and Nuendo already to write StudioOne. I have worked quite extensively with Waves, who are most well known as a plugin company based in Israel. But we did a project several years ago called Waves Tracks Live, which was a DAW designed specifically for live front of house audio work. And it strips a lot of features out. There's no editing, there's no plugins. It had some features targeting front of house engineers. And of course, I work very closely all the time with Harrison, who produced Mixbus, which is a commercial open source project that is based on Ardour, but adds in a bunch of Harrison's ideas about workflow and signal processing. More broadly, frankly, it's inconceivable to me that I would ever go work for another company. The lifestyle that I get out of running my own project, working on my own project, is unbeatable. And I don't think there are any companies out there that could really offer me anything that would be more attractive than this. I'm also old, and the tech industry suffers from an ageism problem too. So the chances of me jumping ship to another company right now, I'm sure they'd much rather hire somebody who can talk Rust or other modern programming languages. So
bring out your Rust now. It's quite fascinating to hear about the connections in the music software industry, like that you've been working with different companies and different people that like everybody recognizes, even though they probably, most of them never heard about Ardour yet. Yeah. I'm trying to rectify that.
And you're doing a good job.
Thanks. I hope I am.
I mean, the original story of this, which, I mean, the first, well, actually, they weren't really the first company, but at around about the same time that Harrison began talking about collaborations on what we could do together, I had a phone call one day with a British voice on the other end. My wife had answered it, and sort of she gave the phone to me, and and I said, "Hi, this is Paul," and the voice on the other end said, "Oh, hi, this is Peter Gabriel," and I said, "Oh, hi, Peter, how are you?" Trying not to be too starstruck, So, Gabriel had just bought Solid State Logic, which is another very long-lived mixing console company, and they were probably the first company to literally just say, we'll pay you to work on Ardour. It didn't last for very long for various reasons that were internal to Solid State Logic, but it was a very nice what's the right way to put this? It was very nice to see that the work I was doing was being seen. It was being seen by people who at least ought to know what they're talking about, and that they thought there was some merit to it. And I suspect at this point in time, I probably don't need that feeling as much. But I think when that happened, it was a very good feeling and really made me feel like I'm probably doing something good here.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely helpful to me. So I'm glad to have Ardour around. So then I guess want to talk a little bit more about your collaborations with Harrison?
Yeah. So the collaboration with Harrison has really been a fantastic thing for the program. And it also is illustrative of a broader point too. One of the issues that happened with Solid State, and has happened with other companies too that I've spoken with, is they just don't understand how they could take a free Libre open source piece of software and ever make any money with it, because it just doesn't seem to make any sense. The software is free, right? I mean, how do we ever make money from doing this? And Ben Loftus at Harrison approached me again, sort of in the 2000, I think it was 2007, 2008-ish kind of time frame, because he had some ideas for some products that Harrison was interested in creating that could be based on Ardour. And to Ben's enormous credit, he never really had a problem with this question. Like, to him, it was just kind of obvious that, well, we could produce something really great for our customers. And the early things we were doing were very specialized things, but it would be really great for our customers. Our customers don't really care whether it's open source or not. They need a tool that gets the job done, and if we can build it for them with open source, everyone is going to be happy. And as time went on, Ben had the idea of what happens if we took Ardour and we changed it so that the workflow was more similar to working on a traditional console. And to just talk a little bit about what that really means, one of the things that's happened with DAWs, if you go back and look at the first DAW, which almost certainly was not Pro Tools, but Pro Tools was the first one that became big and widespread. The workflow it tends to promote is one where, to use a well-worn industry phrase, you fix it in the mix, which is to say that you capture a lot of stuff into the DAW, and then you start messing around with it. And that's really, if you go back and look at what used to happen in analog recording studios in the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the early 90s, that's not really how you would work. There'll be a lot of focus done on trying to make sure that what you were capturing was going to be as good as possible. And what you would do afterwards was really just going to be the icing on the cake. You couldn't possibly go in and fix everything. And so most other proprietary DAWs, at least in 2007, 2008, the whole manner in which you use the program did not really encourage setting things up to capture the best possible sound from the outset. And also, they didn't really have the same concept of channel strips that you would find in a traditional analog console. Those traditional, or the big analog consoles would have that they would have EQs and they'd have compressors built into each channel, and all the audio engineers knew how to use them. They knew they would be recording to tape, so you would get possible tape saturation effects that you could use at the end of it. They would have limiters and other things all built in, and those DAWs didn't. I mean, you could add that. you could add those plugins to each individual track if you wanted to, but they weren't there by default. And a lot of people didn't use the DAWs in that way by default. And Ben and the rest of the guys at Harrison wanted to build something that was more like the way you work with an analog console, which is to say that all these basic plugins are already there, and there's a knob for every single one of them. And we've already set up the signal flow for you so that we've already got your mix buses, which is what you would have had on an analog console. And we've already got your master bus, which has its own separate processing section. And that will be encouraging a different way of working. And so, you know, they changed the whole GUI design of the mixer to look the way they wanted it to look. They didn't really touch the editor. They added their own DSP processing capabilities that are modeled on their consoles, and came up with a product that is entirely open source except for the DSP part. Has a different sort of selling point to Ardour, has a different target for why you should use this tool. And in fact, a lot of people, when they started using Mixbus, I mean, the stories we read all the time was, oh yeah, I use this jack thing, or I use audio hijack to route from my Pro Tools session into Mixbus. And at the time we were like, oh God, like we wanted you to actually use it as a DAW and record into it. But initially, you know, a lot of people were using it just as a post-processing thing. But, you know, Mixbus has gone on to have, you know, a life of its own. We came to a very fair financial arrangement that was designed to make sure that even if Mixbus stole every possible Ardour user in the entire world, I would make about the same amount of money from Ardour as I would if Mixbus didn't exist. Robin, who's in the chat, works. I mean, people who see our commit list or hang around Ardour a lot will realize that Robin is probably the most productive developer that's ever worked on the program. In some technical sense, he actually works for Harrison, but almost all the work that he does actually goes into Ardour first, and then Harrison's Mixbus later. Although he does some other work that's specifically focused on the Harrison side of things. And so, you know, our collaboration has been great. You know, we interact with the Harrison folks on a regular basis, daily. I attend their weekly technical meetings, and it's just all around been a really great thing for the program. And it's been a really great example of, as I said, Ben very early on just realized that we can do a product with this open source thing. It's not an issue for us. And I think every other company that I've interacted with, they love the idea of the program, but when they start to get down to actual product stuff, they're like, yeah, but how's this open source thing work? How do we make money? And, you know, I think Harrison have proved that even in this tiny niche area of audio technology, that you can make it work. So very glad to be in a partnership with them. And I hope and believe that it'll continue to be productive for both the Ardour project and Harrison Mixbus.
Maybe we can look at the Ardour 7 changelog and go through that. What do you think, Paul?
I think that'd be a great idea.
Let's do it.
Or the not yet properly written up, but sort of finished version. All right.
So I see the big point on top is cues or clip launching.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think we can take a look at how this actually works inside of Ardour?
Yeah, we could. It'll probably crash, but no.
That's kidding. Great. That's what I want to see. Why would I work with open source software?
We can have a look at it. Just before you do that, I want to give two little bits of background here as to why we did this or what the goal here was. The first one is that for years, lots of people have wanted to do something with Ardour where where basically their need was like, I've got this drum beat and I just want to use it in my session, or I just want to pull up a drum beat so that I can start playing over it or something. And although you could imagine lots of different ways of doing that, clip launching is one way of doing that. The other background to why we're doing this is because for many, many, many years, I have long admired what Ableton has done with Live. They fundamentally changed the way that people make music with computers. They changed the whole workflow away from this tape model where you have a timeline and you record things along the timeline into something totally different. And before they created live, there were plenty of experimental people who were doing the sorts of things that live let you do, but they made it possible for everyone and their brother and sister in their bedrooms to do this stuff really easily. And I've really admired that, and clip launching was sort of a very fundamental part of that. And I wanted to offer as much as we could of that kind of capability to Ardour users as well. So that said, show us how to use it, Unfa.
Yeah, I have no idea. You
All
tell
right,
me.
So I suggest you switch to the page where we can see Ardour mostly instead of my ugly face.
Now everyone sees Ardour.
There it is.
So
Now we do.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Now everyone sees Ardour.
So the first thing that you're going to want to do. So again, let's just talk about the general idea of this is, if you've used Ardour in the past, or you've used any of the traditional DAWs, Pro Tools, Logic, Cubase, blah, 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 the rest of them, you'll know that most of the workflow for editing and composing and creating is in this window, which is we call the editor window, and you've got things laid out along a timeline. And so you might import material, you might record material, you might draw in MIDI notes, and so on. But you're going to somehow create it lined up along this timeline with this sort of implication, like, well, I want to put this region here. This is where I played the bass, and it sounded like this. So the clip launcher thing is a completely different model. And instead of things being laid out along a timeline, I will get back. There's a big caveat to this, which is one of our extensions. But let's just talk about the live Bitwig model first. Is a way of actually playing material that doesn't have a particular position on the timeline. It's material that you launch just because you want to hear it right now. So obviously, because it's so different, we're not going to do very much with it in this editor window. So if you go over to the upper right, there used to be 3 buttons up here that were labeled Rec, Edit, and Mix. And there's now an extra one that says Q. And if you click on Q, you will get into a completely new tab that didn't exist before. You'll notice it's mostly blank right now. And just for the simplest possible demonstration, because you may not have any other material right now, if you click on the FLAC link or thing there, if you double click on it, you'll hear it.
Yeah, it's played because I have autoplay enabled.
That's right.
Yeah, there's a checkbox, and
there we go. Yeah, so if you turn autoplay off, you have to double click it. If you have autoplay on, it'll just play.
I'll check if it plays on stream. It does. Okay, everybody hears it. Except you.
Okay. Okay, except me. Great.
The
Okay.
magic of live audio routing. The magic of a live audio routing.
That's fine.
So I think I can fix that.
So to do a completely trivial example, which is almost useless, but so if you simply click and drag on that over into the open space.
Yep.
So that created a new track, and we have in the track here. It looks a little bit like the mixer strip, but it's missing all the ratios of things have changed a little bit. And at the very top of it, rather than the buttons for input and output and phase control and all this kind of stuff, we have a set of 8 slots that you can put bits of audio or bits of MIDI in. Obviously, if it's an audio track, we just created an audio track because this was an audio clip. We've got 8 slots in here, and if you click on the little white arrow next to the slot that has something in it,
it plays.
It plays. Now, this happens to be Ardour's own click at 120 BPM, which is the default session.
How to stop it?
If you stop it, yeah, this is confusing in live too. Do you see that little rotating pie thing down the bottom?
Oh,
that's the
somehow I did
place to stop it. Yeah,
I think I switched.
You can also click on any empty slot on the square button there.
Yeah, that's exactly how live does it. Because then at the bottom one is basically your stop button.
Yeah,
which can be represented on your controller, or could just not.
Yeah. So that's not very interesting because everybody's heard the click before. But if you now go to your tempo button, which is just below the clock, and you click on the tempo and change that to whatever, 85 or something.
Let's do 85, as you say.
Yeah. And then go back and click on this again. Okay, it now fits the tempo. Now, the other thing that you didn't notice, if you can stop it again for me and stop the transport.
Oh.
Actually, you don't need to stop the transport, but that's fine. So if you look up at the clock. Oh,
it's weird.
I was going to. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it. Can you hear? Can you hear it? I tried to route Ardour.
Yes, I can hear it.
Okay. Does it sound right? Because I feel like it doesn't change the tempo of the click.
Yeah, I'm not sure it did either.
It seems like it's delayed, but it still seems like.
Go press the real click button. The one in the top corner where the little metronome icon.
No, in just Ardour's regular metronome, so we can hear him.
Yeah. Ah, my
top
regular.
Top left.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, so the metronome plays 85, but the clip here does play 120.
That was a really successful demonstration, wasn't it? I have no idea why that's happening. I guess that means I'm going to have to go back into testing again.
That's why it's not final yet.
Yeah,
that's
the release candidate.
Really weird because I've been testing this like day in, day out for days, and that should have just changed the tempo of that. Let me just.
There's an option for stretching tempo. I see. We have a panel,
and it's turned on, right? Let me just briefly try something here and just see if indeed it's just been broken in some recent build or if there's something else going on.
Live Ardour debugging.
Yeah. Watch Paul work on Ardour live.
The excitement.
No, that worked just fine.
Interesting. So
we can move on because I understand what was supposed to happen, and I believe I saw a very early version of this where the clip launcher was a plugin, and that did work. I remember that working. So yeah, that's something doesn't click here, pun intended, but I guess we all know what it's supposed to do, and there's lots of interesting things here. Oh, I think we can't hear you, Paul.
Uh-oh. Oh, Ardour might have stolen his.
Could it be that? Yeah.
Yeah, he'll get it. So then I guess we'll talk for 1 second while Paul sorts that out. Yeah, I'm pretty excited for clip launching. I used to write music like that for a little while. And just restructure. What I would do, actually, I would write all the sections to my song, and then I'd split it up on the clip launcher, and then I would just play through it, and like when it felt like it was time for, you know, the next section or the breakdown or whatever, I would just launch the clips then. This works great for like progressive house and stuff. They're really straightforward genres.
I'm guessing you can hear me again?
Yes, you're back.
We can hear you.
All right, good. Yeah, so what should have happened was that it would stretch and fit the current tempo. The other important part of this is that when you launched it, if you look down at the bottom in the second box, the launch options, the launch quantize setting was 1 bar. And so if you actually click on it right now, you will notice that the clip doesn't actually start playing until the transport rolls through the next bar boundary. 1 bar will make it a little bit more obvious what's happening. If you set it to a small value, you may not be able to tell the difference. So if you leave it at 1 bar and go up and start the clip, I don't know what's happening here, Unfa. I really wish this was not happening, but well, you have to listen to my voice over rather than the demonstration that's happening here. Highly awkward. All right, so that should have started exactly on the bar, and when you stop it, it will actually stop on less than the bar quantization, but again, it will stop in time with the music. And so the real feature of using this clip launching stuff, and this is the stuff that Live really pioneered, is that you're introducing musical material. It is automatically stretched to fit the tempo, and it automatically starts and stops on your musical time grid. And so nothing ever really goes in and out of time. Everything is aligned and not off. Now, obviously, you know, if you're doing more experimental kind of music, that may not be what you want. But for a lot of the kind of music that many people make, that's exactly what you want. We have not replicated everything that is in Live. So let's talk a little bit about the properties down at the bottom that John is currently sitting directly on top of.
I gotta move you out of the way, John. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
No. So there is, Unfa, can you move the window over towards its right-hand side? Oh, that's you. Oh, you move it. There we go. They're in the blank space. So we have 4 boxes down here that talk about the clip, various things to do with the clip. These boxes show up whenever you select a clip. You'll see how it's surrounded by red in the strip up there. The clip properties is the first one. And they are really not to do with the audio itself. They're sort of metadata-y kind of things to do with it. Second one, launch options. This is where you get really into the live stuff. The most significant ones here are probably the launch type. And some of these do not function correctly yet, but there are, if you click on the trigger, you'll see there's several different types of launch styles. And trigger just means it starts playing. And there's other ones down here that will they'll give you different behaviors when the clip starts up that are kind of useful. Launch quantize controls what musical grid point the clip will start to play on. And for a lot of things, 1 bar is about right. But if you're working with one-off sounds, you might want them to be on a quarter note, for example, so that they would play pretty much exactly when you hit the controller. There's I actually can't even read them on your screen. Can you zoom in a little bit, Unfa? Because I'm actually reading it off the video.
Yep.
There we go. There's legato mode, which again I think is not quite working and needs to be handled before the release. So legato mode is a kind of sophisticated thing where you switch between 2 clips, but you maintain relative position within them. So if you were halfway through the first one, you start halfway through the second one. Q isolate we can talk about later, but it's a bit complicated and related to something else. Velocity sense. If you were controlling this from a device that can send MIDI velocity, you can turn up how much the MIDI velocity affects the volume of the clip. By default, it has no effect at all, and you just hear the audio as is. If you turn this all the way up, then your MIDI keyboard or MIDI pad controller or something will control the volume. Now, the next thing that Live did that was sort of the basis of the revolution, really, that they created with this was it's not enough to just play this particular sound. The question is, what happens after the sound's finished, right? Obviously, if you were playing, for example, drum pads, the answer is easy, which is I'm going to make it start, and when it's finished, it should just stop because I'm trying to play a kick drum. And that will be fine if you were manually playing drums. But if you were playing loops, for example, you might want 1 loop to play and then switch to another loop that was somehow related to it, and then maybe to another loop, and then maybe come back to the first loop. And so if you click on the follow options drop downs, there are 2 possible follow options for each clip, each cue. Stop is the trivial one, which means after you play, just stop. Don't do anything else. But you can also make it so you can pick again, which would be the just keep on looping forever. That would be useful for some fairly basic things. You can also choose forward or reverse, which means it'll go to the next occupied slot or the previous occupied slot, and these will loop around. Or you can make it jump, and the jump one brings up a dialogue, which will give you the 2 slots, or you can have a multi-jump thing where you can say where you want it to jump. So if you close that window for a moment, or maybe you can imagine it, if you imagine the other slots were filled, you could actually say that after A is played, I want you to jump to either D, E, or F, but I'm not going to pick which one. So if you engage them, now we don't have anything in those slots, so it won't do anything. But that would mean
introduce some controlled chaos.
That's right. And obviously, how much chaos will depend a lot on what you actually had in slot D, E, and F. If you had a loop in there that was extremely similar to the loop in A, it's going to be just a subtle variation. A drum pattern where there's a couple of extra hits or a couple of less hits. On the other hand, if you change from one type of sound to a completely different type of sound, then now you're talking about real chaos. There are 2 follow options. And there's a slider below them which controls the probability of picking one or the other. And so this introduces yet another layer of chaos, in the sense that most of the time it might pick repeat or again, but every once in a while it might go on to the next clip. And so you
wow.
Yeah, no, live does all this stuff.
This
Now
tickles my imagination. I have not worked with Ableton Live, so this is new to me.
And then below that, we have a follow count. And what the follow count says is if you're using something like forward or reverse, for example, if you bump follow count up to, say, 2, what this means is the way you have this set up right now, let's move the probability slider all the way back to 100% left. And this means, okay, we're going to pick again. Oh, I'm sorry. No, again, it's the wrong side. Move it all the way to the right. I'm sorry. Move the probability slider all the way to the right. Okay, so this means every single time we're going to go forward to the next slot when this clip finishes. Oh, but wait, the follow count's only 1. Okay, so we'll do it right after it finishes. But if you bump it up to 2, what this actually means is it's going to play it twice before it picks the follow action. And you could have it 3 or 4 or however many times that you want. And so this is sort of like a built-in repeat count before we decide what to do next. There's also follow length, and this is a bit sophisticated for me to try to explain in this context. Let's just say that this lets you control how much of the clip will actually play before you consider the follow option. And you can set it to less than the clip length or more than the clip length to get some very different kinds of effects. I'll be doing a demo video of this once we get the release out to sort of talk through it. Or you can watch the many videos there are about Ableton Live. And then finally, in the last box, we have the stretch options, and this will show you one of the most important things here is the BPM. Ardour will try to detect the tempo of the clip. And it does a relatively good job. It's not perfect. We give you divide by 2, multiply by 2 buttons to help you fix the most obvious errors. If it detects BPM and it thinks it's got a good answer, then the stretch button will be turned on. And that means that when we play it, we will try to stretch it to fit the tempo. And the button on the other side of that is the stretch options, which anybody who's seen the time effects tool in Ardour will have some idea of what these settings mean.
Well,
what just happened?
I pressed tab. I was being smart.
Oh yeah, you pressed escape, so we lost the button. If you click on it again, there we go.
There we go.
and then finally, there's a clip length setting, which again can be used to determine how long Ardour actually thinks the clip is. And this sort of interacts with the BPM counter. So Ardour analyzed this clip and decided it was 4 beats long and it's 120 BPM. You could change the clip length. I think if you change it down to 2, for example, you'll see the BPM change.
Clip length.
That's an auto.
2.
Yeah, there we go. So now it thinks the BPM is only 60. And that will affect, what the stretch does. Now, the thing that's missing here, I mentioned this earlier, if you were to use Live or Bitwig, the area that your mouse pointer is in right now, to the right of all those boxes, would have a clip editor in it. And it would let you actually control the starts and ends of the clips. And if it was MIDI data, it would actually allow you to edit the MIDI contents of that clip as well. That will be coming in some future version. I don't want to commit to any particular time frame. Now, it's unfortunate that there's some bug in this session that is not stretching things properly. I think because of that, it's not worth us, and because we have a lot of other stuff to get to, we should perhaps move on. But let's just do one little experiment here. If you stop the transport, just because the clock is distracting me.
Oh yeah, it's been
if
running.
If you go up to Window, the Window main menu, and go down to Library Downloader. For the first time, Ardour is going to be providing some content. And thanks to some very fine beat and loop makers at looperman.com who provide totally free samples for you to use. And I have their explicit agreement to redistribute them under a CC by 0 license in almost every case. We've now got some loops in here that you can download and start using. And the smallest one, I think, is Linux. There's a dance hall one in there somewhere. I think it's only like 37 megabytes or something.
It's 7 megabytes even.
Is that the
Negus
dance hall
beats
one?
dance
Yeah.
hall, yeah.
Yeah. So if you just click on the install button,
it shows
installed. Now you can close the window. And if you go back, if you click on Ardour bundle content.
Oh, right. Now we've seen Negus beats dance hall.
And now you can drag one of those into a different track. Just drag it into the open area.
Now it plays immediately.
Okay. So now click on this little start button. Now let's try changing their tempo on this one. Change the main tempo underneath the transport clock. Let's go back up to like 120 or something.
This works.
Yeah. So now we could, if we wanted to, mess around with putting other clips in and looking at the follow actions and stuff. But I think since this is not actually a clip launching tutorial, we can move on. But yeah,
this is very very interesting. I haven't seen any of that. I looked at Ardour 7 like pre-release builds. I stopped looking at them, kind of to let myself be surprised, and I'm happy I did, because this has changed and developed immensely. It's a completely different thing, and it seems to be a completely different workflow. I did not imagine Ardour could go in this direction and allow such things, and this is really cool because I have been looking for a live sequencer, and there are many open source live sequencers, but all of them have their good and bad. They are nice and they are ugly sides, and unfortunately more ugly sides than nice. Plus, I really like to keep my things in the DAW, so it's easy to pick up a project I've been working on before. It's easy to archive it, send it to someone. I'm not very keen on using session managers that open up multiple programs to route them together. I prefer not to need that. So I'm interested in seeing how Ardour can make that happen, especially with MIDI, because I synthesize everything.
Now, the other thing I would like to just mention briefly about the MIDI stuff that is kind of cool. One of big limitations in live, and I still to this day don't understand why they did this, is that live has zero concept of MIDI channels, in the sense that they force everything to channel 1. Okay. Now, because we have MIDI channels everywhere in Ardour, we've never tried to hide them or do anything with them. This means that you can actually load multi-channel MIDI clips. And it means that you can actually do things in the clips that you can't do properly with only one channel. So, for example, drum flams, where you actually need to have one hit on channel 1 and then the next hit on channel 2. So you actually get 2 hits, even though the first one's supposed to keep ringing while the second one happens. It's impossible to do this in live or Bitwig or actually Bitwig. I don't know if Bitwig handles it, but anyway, live you certainly can't do this because they force everything to one channel. Whereas here you can actually have multi-channel, multi-timbral MIDI loops, and this allows for a lot of possibilities. They can also include program changes to make sure you always get the right sound. There is another button that if we did a MIDI clip here, you would see over in the clip properties, you can turn off the patch changes because sometimes it's not actually what you want. It's like, I want to use this MIDI pattern, but I don't want to use the program, the patch that it came with. I'm just going to leave it and do my own sound. And so the MIDI stuff is really cool. Some of the MIDI loops that I was playing with in the last couple of weeks are multi-timbral drum stuff. And just listening to what you can do by just changing out the voices for one of the hits is just fantastic. Obviously, you can do that in live too. It's just that here, splitting them across channels allows you to do timing stuff that would not be possible otherwise. Before we get away from clips, let's just talk about the one other big thing that we've done here. Partly because we didn't implement the editor, our guilty conscience said, oh, we have to come up with something else that's really cool. What could we do that if we're not going to have a proper editor down there to let you to determine where my sample begins and ends or what have you, let's do something else that's really cool. And if you go back to the editor window, or tab, or whatever we want to call it, and you'll notice down in all the rulers up top, there's a ruler at the bottom there now called Q markers.
Q markers, yes.
And if you right click anywhere on there,
QA,
and click, let's have QA,
QB,
and let's mute. Yeah, well, you've only got one slot filled, so it's not really worth it. But let's mute the first track because it's got the horrible clip sample that doesn't do anything.
Yep. And
now just move the playhead all the way back to the beginning. And oh, I'm sorry, not back to the beginning. Let's move it back to. I didn't realize we were so far in.
Yeah, me neither.
Well, just drop another Q marker somewhere. Oh, there it is. Put the playhead there and just roll. So now you can sequence these cues from the timeline. Now just jump to a little bit after that green Q marker.
Oh, it picks up.
Sample accurate.
It knows that there should be a clip here, and it just picks up.
Just picks
up. This is crazy. And it's crazy awesome. Oh, I have so many questions and ideas.
So that's so this is a workflow that you cannot do in any other DAW. Live and Bitwig obviously have had clip launching for a long time. DP10 has it. Logic has it now. I think there might be another one or two that have it. None of them have this notion of being able to actually put what these essentially are, to use their terminology. If you go back to the Q page for a moment, those green buttons on the very far side, these are scene launch buttons. So when you click one of these, they activate the whole scene, which is everything in every slot in every track will start.
So everything in the row A, for example,
everything in row A, right? Now, live has gone a bit overboard, and we did not do this. They actually have follow actions for scenes, which, maybe we'll implement it at some point, but it just seemed like, really? I don't know. I mean, I guess it's kind of handy, but it gets a bit crazy when you start doing that stuff.
Maybe let's not overcomplicate it first.
Yeah. Well, what we're essentially allowing you to do is to trigger those scene buttons from the timeline. so that you can play around with a bunch of stuff in this cue page, find some arrangements that you like, find some combinations of different sounds or different grooves that sort of go together. Go back to the timeline. Oh, by the way, I should say that you can record the cue markers as well. That I can't quite remember how.
Record
no,
cues.
it's not.
Oh,
Yes, record cues. There we go. And so now, if you start playing and you launch slots, or if you launch scenes, they'll be recorded into the timeline. Yeah, that'll be good. Now go back to the stop the transfer. Go back to the edit window.
There are my cues, and they're synced to time, synced to grid.
They are somewhat synced to grid, but if you drop one manually, you can put them anywhere you want manually, but the clip still will not start until its quantization tells it to start. So if it has bar quantization, but you drop it a few hits, a little bit before the bar, it doesn't mean it's going to start where you put the marker. It means it'll start at the quantize point, because the whole point of this is to get everything lined up. Yeah. By the way, you can turn off quantization, and that means that when you launch that slot, it just starts right now. And you would use that, for example, if you had samples that were just like, I don't know, you got some crazy boom, right? Or some other drum sound or some other percussive sound, and you just want to go boom.
Maybe you want to play drum accents, just, add a little percussion that is
exactly
improvised.
Yeah. So that timeline thing, the idea is mess around in the cue page, come up with some things that you like, maybe record yourself playing triggering the scenes, record all that. Now it's on the timeline. Now go back to the timeline. Maybe you want to play live over it. Maybe you want to play your guitar, or you want to sing out of tune over it, or something else. But basically, everybody I've spoken to who uses live, the one thing they've always said about it that has impressed me is that it may not be the DAW that you want to finish a track in, but as a way of playing around and experimenting with what the track might be, it was sort of unsurpassed until Bitwig came along. And what we're trying to do here is to integrate that idea with the notion that actually you might go back to the timeline in Ardour and actually really do a lot more work on the timeline. And so having the cues there means that you can still use these loops that you've liked and enjoyed, but now go back to the editor and actually do the kind of work that you were already used to doing in a linear editor.
I have a question and an idea. Is because one thing that I guess people might want to do is to compose a track on the timeline in the editor view, and then pick clips, pick loops, and put them into the cues so they can then perform their composition live.
Totally trivial. So you can record in the timeline. In fact, why don't you do this right now on that first track? Why don't you just record an empty region for, I don't know, a few seconds?
Woo!
Okay, and now let's see. I think I actually don't know how to do this. Robin, tell me how to do this. Try right-clicking on it a minute.
Right click. Because I
actually don't know.
I don't know. Maybe it's ranges. Oh wait, there's start and end.
No. It's nothing to do with that. It's in the region itself. There's an operation to put it directly into the slot.
Wow.
I wonder if Robin's even still watching. There is an operation that's very easily accessible where you could take that region and just put it into one of your slots.
I imagine I could sequence a drum beat or a bass line and then slice the different versions of that into clips, and then be able to trigger my synthesizers or samplers live.
Yes, and in fact, another workflow that we were trying to support here is one, like if you watch videos on people using live, one of the things that you'll notice is that, particularly the ones that Ableton produces, is that an awful lot of the time they get everything right the first time. It's really remarkable. Like they record a little 4-bar thing on their guitar and it's exactly correct. And as we were thinking about how many people might actually come up with material if they play an instrument, this is not really the in the box thing so much, but if you play an instrument, you're probably going to be grooving around and doing a bunch of stuff, and maybe you've got a beat going, but you're playing your guitar, you're playing bass, or playing something else, and you're just farting around, and eventually something comes up that seems to be about right. And what?
Robin in chat said how to do this. It's an option in bounce. What about MIDI though? Can we bounce MIDI?
That can't be right.
It is now. It is here now. It's muted though, because you can move it to a different track. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think, I don't know. Maybe I didn't understand what he meant, but
it does work. All right. So this is for audio. Yeah. I'm.
Oh, it does. I see.
It's bounce.
So
yeah.
It's bounce. All right. So you could have been jamming along for a while, and somewhere in the middle there was this point where you suddenly thought that was awesome, and you can go back and trim the region down and get that little thing and just bounce it straight into a slot, and then use that. And so we were trying to support both this kind of totally in the box thing, where you've got loops and clips and samples that you want to use or think you might want to use, but you can also be a person who just like is messing around with musical ideas, and after a half an hour or 2 hours of playing, there was some stuff in there that you thought you'd like to create a track with. So
I wonder if I can make a clip from a MIDI track or something. I made a little drum beat.
Yeah.
It's hardly a beat, but it is a drum loop. Say a kick drum. I wonder if I can bounce this. Bounce. Okay, but it's going to bounce into audio, I guess. Bounce to clip library.
No, this will go to the clip library, not the slot. Now,
Right.
there is a...
Okay.
Yeah, and part of the reason for this is, I think, that you created the track here. Can you just do cancel for a minute and click on the Q button up in the top right again?
Yep.
So you can see the Q tab.
Oh, what is that?
That is the MIDI track you created.
Aha. Oh.
So actually, I would have expected the bounce here to offer the choice to go directly into a slot.
Because it would bounce to MIDI, not to audio.
Yes, it will bounce to MIDI. It won't bounce to audio.
Robin writes.
No,
Robin
actually,
writes,
I think Robin writes. Yep.
The bounce dialog has bounce to slot option. MIDI works too. Without processing, you can add it to the slot.
There we go. So with processing is right.
Bounce.
With processing is going to generate audio, and so that goes into the clip library, so you could use it. Without processing, leaves you the MIDI, which you can use directly in the track.
Yeah. So we have two options for MIDI clips: bounce without processing and with processing. So I guess with processing produces an audio clip.
Audio. Yeah, and that goes to the library, and then you can use that in an audio track.
Right, because we can't put an audio clip as a cue into our MIDI track. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Maybe it would be good to add like a little with processing or like into audio. Maybe that would make it a little bit easier to understand for people.
Yeah, we are overloading that menu item a little bit there.
Whoa. Okay. Bounce to trigger slot.
Yeah.
Let's make D because I didn't use that one. Bounce. Oh, it's there. D. It doesn't seem to play. It does play. It plays, yeah.
Yeah.
So I have managed to synthesize a kick drum, even in this live stream. Are you happy, guys?
And you can now go back up to the tempo button and decide you want all of it. Do you want all of this at 92 or something?
Maybe 91 because that's the year I was born.
Yeah.
It just works. I don't know what happens to my timeline though. Does my timeline fall apart? Do all the cues stay on? Yeah, the cues stayed where they were, so they fell out of alignment with the
That's
alt tempo.
Interesting observation. I think I have not thought of that before. So that's a good thing for me to scribble down.
I also always like to provide feedback and bug reports with these live streams. For Zrythm, there was more stuff I could I could show, probably needing work.
All right.
Robin Garrias says, with processing could also mean MIDI filters, no synth. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think if you have MIDI processing on a MIDI track, you probably want to not bake it in and then run it again for the same processing, MIDI processing, I mean.
Yeah.
For example, if I have a MIDI plugin that, I don't know, randomly plucks my chords, I probably don't want to pre-pluck my chords and then re-plug them again.
Yeah, or as we were discussing earlier, maybe you do, because that's part of your experimental sound design workflow, right?
Yep.
So you can do either of them here.
Wow, crazy stuff. Do you think we should maybe move on through the change list, because we have 30 minutes left, and this is amazing. I'm really looking forward to this. I would like to ask a question about MIDI and how the MIDI time is handled, but maybe it's going to come up in the changelog. So what do you think?
I'm
Paul?
just going to very quickly answer John and say that in this release, there is only going to be support for using the push 2 surface from Ableton to launch clips. The internal architecture is already there to launch them from MIDI notes. But coming up with a design that would let you use let's say a standard MIDI keyboard and do something sensible with it is a little bit challenging. So this release will see the push 2 support. Another dot release, maybe 7.1, maybe 7.2, will have support for the Novation Launchpad to do this stuff with. And then along the way, I may come up with ideas for how to provide just a totally generic mapping. The issue is that you could have more tracks than fit on the screen, and you could actually have more slots that you can see, and deciding what this note is actually supposed to trigger to match up with what a person's really looking at on the screen, it becomes quite complex. Even in the case of the pads like the push 2 and the launch pad, this notion that you need to scroll around up and down makes things somewhat complicated as well. And so for that reason, why we held back on it, even though the mechanism is already in place internally. All right. So moving on.
Yep. There we go. Internal time representation.
Yeah, I think it's not worth saying a lot about this because for most users, this is just it's a bit of technical internal stuff that they don't really need to know about. What I will say is that the main thing the design is intended to do is to limit or hopefully eliminate bugs that happen in Ardour 6 and earlier, where particularly we're dealing with MIDI, and the question is, how do we represent the time of that MIDI note? Is it measured in samples, or is it measured in some sort of musical duration? And in Ardour 7, we have a completely clear separation between these two time domains, and anything that's supposed to be in audio time is in audio time. Everything that's supposed to be musical time is in musical time. And we try to limit the conversions that we do between them. But it basically means that hopefully you will no longer run into bugs such as, I have a MIDI note at the very beginning of this region and it sometimes doesn't play. And I don't think users need to know a lot more about it than that, unless they're into some really hairy code that I'm sort of proud of, but wish we didn't need. And if they're into that, then they should go read the source code. So let's talk about ripple modes, because this is cool.
Let's go.
I think. So we didn't do a very good job with ripple editing in previous versions, and there are still some things left to be done, particularly if you like to do classical 4-point editing that they use in classical music production. But we have changed and I think dramatically improved and made more understandable the way that ripple editing works. So ripple editing, for those who don't understand what it means, if you select a range of a track or the whole session and you cut it out, the default behavior in Ardour is that all the material that came after that just stays in the same place. It does not move, which unfa is about to demonstrate. So he chopped out part of that region, and the bit that was later stayed exactly where it was. Now, if he was to undo that operation, and then he goes up to the editing mode button and selects ripple. Oh, actually, I don't want you to do this with a region selection. Can you make that a time selection instead of a region one? And just, yeah. There we go. Okay, so now delete. And this time we deleted it, and later material moved back to fill up the gap. So that's the basic of ripple editing, which is you cut out a chunk of time and the material afterwards ripples backwards in time to fill in what was removed. And, this is not necessarily of so much use for music editing, although it can be used there, but it's really valuable for use in things like podcasts, any kind of vocal production or anything like that, where you've literally just got words that you do not want in the finished version and you want to get rid of them, and that means all the later words should move up.
Yeah, it's recording like voice acting, voiceovers, or all the lip smacks. This speeds this work a lot.
Yeah. So the next thing that we've done is to split ripple into 3 related and hopefully logically understandable variants. So ripple selected is the one where when you make that time selection, which unfa did a minute ago, that time selection just showed up in a single track. And when we deleted it, if you leave it as selected, because you don't have enough other tracks here yet, when he deleted it, just that track rippled. Now, if he had another track in the session here,
which I'll create,
which he's about to get.
I was hearing a different beat, so that's going to be bad. But there we go.
It's fine. I mean, you can mute it if you're going to play, but we're not going to play it back anyway.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. So now if you select on if you do a time select on one of those tracks.
So R for range.
Yep. Time select. And
now we are in ripple selected. I'm hitting delete.
Okay. So we're only going to ripple the selected track. That's the only track that was selected. And that's what happens. Now, there are some scenarios where this is precisely what you want. There are other scenarios where it's not what you want. You want to operate across the whole session at once. So we can undo. If you go back to ripple all mode. Okay, so now select a different time range. It would have been nice if it had propagated, but
yeah.
So now the key thing here, which John helped me to understand the other day in trying to describe this, the real way to understand the relationship of these different modes is how does a selection process behave? When you're in ripple selected, you select something in one track and you select something in however many tracks you want to, and those are the tracks that will be affected. When you're in ripple all mode, the selection propagates across every track. And then when you do the deletion, it will affect every track. Okay. The difference is you don't have to think, did I select all the tracks? I want to work across all the tracks all the time. Just put me in ripple all mode. And I don't have to, I can now just drag in a single track, but the selection propagates across all the tracks. And therefore, when I delete, then the ripple will happen across all tracks. And so, if you were working with material here where everything needs to stay aligned, then ripple all is what you would probably be using. However, as some of you know, a few months ago, or at the beginning of this year, I sat down and did a very long chat with Justin Frankel, the lead developer of Reaper. And we recorded that in Reaper, and then I edited it in Ardour. And it was the first experience I had of editing, a podcasty 2-person speaking to each other thing. And it was awful because you don't actually want either of these 2 modes. What you actually want is what we call interview mode. And so if you can go back up to there and go to interview mode. And what happens in interview mode, my mind is now going blank, and I can't. Let me just go back and read what's new to remind myself of how this works. Right. Mhm. Yeah. That's right. So if you do exactly what John just said, imagining that the upper track in our session here is Paul speaking, and he has just said and you want to get rid of it, but in the meantime Justin is speaking in the other track. So now hold on, can you press escape to cancel the track selection first? There we go.
Okay, I had to click and then
do
escape.
the selection. Yeah, so you do the selection of Paul saying in that top track, but unfa, or the other person, is speaking in the other track, and we definitely don't want to cut that out. Okay. So hold on, I didn't want you to propagate the selection.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so now if you delete that, it doesn't ripple. Okay.
Yep.
So you just cut out the or the R or the tongue smack or the whatever it was, but everything has stayed in alignment. What the upper person was saying, what the lower person is saying, is still properly aligned. Okay. And the same there, if you delete that.
Okay, I thought it's going to ripple. I thought it's going to ripple now.
But now let's pretend that the end of that lower region, where we've got that big block of waveform, let's suppose that both people speaking in that are both, I don't know, they both made a horrible noise that shouldn't be part of the recording. So you do a time range selection.
Yep.
And then you propagate across both tracks and you delete it. And
all
now
right,
they both ripple.
Okay, so the interview mode only ripples when we have more than one track selected.
Correct.
With our range tool.
Correct.
That's interesting.
So then I have a quick question from Ovi. What happens to automation lanes?
So that's a good question. I don't know whether I want to answer it. So in general, well, I know what happens to automation lanes. It's not necessarily good. It won't be the answer that you're looking for, I think, but we could try it and see. Right. Yep. So you'll notice that doing a time range selection does not propagate down into the automation track. If you make it propagate down into it,
then
doesn't
you'll
ripple.
Get
something.
Yeah, it doesn't ripple.
Yeah.
So maybe in all mode it does ripple. Let's see.
I think it does not, because we don't consider the automation tracks to be completely distinct. So the workflow here that's imagined is that you would do your editing first before you did any automation for example, noise suppression or sibilant suppression, stuff like that. You would edit it first and then you'd add automation. But that's something that we probably could and shall improve in the future.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
As a person who works a lot with MIDI and automation, being able to edit automation alongside MIDI and audio regions, would be very helpful, because sometimes you just spend a lot of time control clicking automation lanes, trying to make sure you didn't miss any, just to copy and paste a song section or move it.
And to go back to a question that was asked earlier about why should you use Ardour instead of StudioOne, this is something that we have been looking at StudioOne very carefully at, because they have a very nice concept in there where essentially you can define time ranges in a way that literally means I mean everything. I don't care whether it's on the screen or whether it's off the screen. I mean everything from here to here is what this section is. And when I cut and paste it, or I cut it and ripple, or whatever it is that I'm doing, it's everything. It's the whole session. And myself and Robin and Ben and Harrison have talked on and off over several years about the need to have that kind of editing workflow. Because one of the things that can trivially happen right now is that, you just maybe you actually did have a track selected, but it's off screen. What does that mean when you cut? Like, you couldn't see it. So did you mean to cut it, or did you not mean to cut it? We need to have better ways of answering that question for users. So
then,
3 new. Just sorry, please go ahead,
I was
John.
going to say, I see one real quick question on automation before we get back to the changelog.
Yep.
Is there any plans for curved automation? Do I just not know it exists?
No, it does not exist.
Okay.
It does not exist. Adding that will probably be a part of another major effort that we might do. Could be a part of Ardour 8. I'm not sure.
All right.
Mostly to do with modulation in general.
Makes sense.
And if we start doing modulation in general, it will probably start to include curves.
Sweet. I'm excited for that. So then I guess next we're on to mixer scenes then, right? Which is another great feature.
Yep.
I'd say.
So mixer scenes is all Robin's work, to give credit where it's due. And it's pretty simple to explain. They show up in the lower left of the mixer view, as long as you have show mixer lists enabled. And
lower left of the
mixer. You're in the editor view, aren't you?
Yeah.
So you have to go to the.
I gotta get to.
Yep, they're there. And then we're in the way of them, I think.
Yeah,
you are in the way of them.
I need to
Come and stand on my head.
I need to get rid of. I need to get rid of myself and John for a while. Right click, store. Scene name. A. Right. Does it also store plugin layouts and presets? Oh, so I can do this. And even maybe that. Make my kick really bad. Okay, store the second one. B. Recall mixer scene A. This will overwrite your mixed settings. The separation cannot be undone. Yeah. It got back the mixers stuff. It didn't change the plugin ordering and didn't roll back the plugin state. Gotcha. Oh yeah, that's on my end.
Either. Paul, just keep talking.
You're back.
Just keep babbling for a moment.
There we go.
Mixer scenes are awesome and do not restore plugins. They restore the parameters of plugins, but they do not restore the presence of plugins.
Robin says a scene restores all automatable plugins. So is it possible that we can't automate that portion of GeonKick?
GeonKick isn't quite automatable. It doesn't have any automatable parameters.
That makes sense.
All right. So the ordering of the processing stack, I don't know if it is expected to be stored. It did not.
Yeah, I don't know if Robin
did not change.
Yes, he said plugin positions are not saved and restored.
Okay.
Now, the one other cool trick with this is if you put your middle mouse button over one of those buttons down there and click on that.
Yep. Oh, it previews.
Momentary.
I can momentarily listen to how it sounds.
Yeah.
Oh, John, I think this is perfect for you.
Yeah, for my 9 million mixed versions.
I think you may just finish that In the Realm mix with this feature by the end of the year.
We can only pray. I'll at least have another 700 scenes for it. Yeah, I'll go become the biggest bug tester for mixer scenes in about 2 days. When
expect
All right.
a DDoS on Mantis. Actually, not a distributor, just a denial of service attack from John.
You're right.
All right, keeping my eye on a ticking clock. So that's Mixer Scenes. Very powerful. Very
Yep.
easy to use. Could maybe get extended in a few subtle directions in the future, but essentially does what we think it should do right now. MIDI editing. I don't know if we really have time to go through at this point and demonstrate all these sort of tweaks to MIDI editing, but there's, you know, a good dozen to 10 to 20 tweaks that have happened to MIDI editing that will hopefully make working with MIDI that little bit easier and simple for most people.
The thing that I am most interested in is if there are no timing errors with MIDI and like missing first note in a region, because these are the most troublesome things to me, at least.
We do believe that has been fixed. Several people had sessions that they've redone in 7 and they don't have the problem now. The moment I hear from anyone that's happening again, I will first vomit and then immediately jump on the problem and try to fix it.
Then we should do it on a live stream.
No, definitely not on the live stream. You guys shouldn't have to see that. One other thing that actually came from a suggestion from John last week that was one of those great examples of how Ardour development happens, which is that sometimes it just takes somebody asking about a problem or a feature in just the right way that makes it suddenly totally obvious that is the right thing to do, even when it has not been previously. And so anybody who's used to using Ardour and MIDI knows that we have linked MIDI region copies and unlinked MIDI region copies. And until last week, when you made an unlinked MIDI region copy, it was only as long as the visible region that you copied it from. So if you had recorded, let's say, 12 bars of MIDI and you trimmed it down to 4 bars and then you copied it unlinked, the other bars didn't exist. You couldn't trim it back out. That's not true anymore. So when you make an unlinked MIDI region copy, it has all the bars accessible, so you can just trim it back out to include them. It's a tiny little detail, but you know, as I said, sometimes it just takes the right explanation.
Awesome.
And luckily, that only took you a day. I don't even think you worked on it a whole day. I think it only took you a few minutes.
Yeah, it was about 20 minutes worth of work. It was very easy.
And it saved me 20 minutes of work already.
There we go. The power of programming. I work for 20 minutes. It saves 1,000 people 20 minutes. MIDI stem export has been added. So you in Ardour forever, you could, well, not forever, but for quite a few versions, you could do stem exports of your audio tracks, which gives you one file per track instead of it all being mixed down. This is typically what gets used when moving sessions from door to door, or making archival copies, or making stems that can be used by Rick Beato on his YouTube channel to take apart your music. We have now added this for MIDI tracks too. You couldn't do that before, but so if you have MIDI tracks in the session, you can do a stem export of them and get one MIDI file per track. It's quite useful if you're in that kind of workflow. Let's see, another sort of big deal for people who've been around Ardour for a long time. This is the return of an old feature for people who have not been around Ardour. There is a magnificent website run out of a university in Barcelona called Freesound that has thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of free, meaning Creative Commons by something licenses, oodles of samples covering almost everything that you can think of. Not so much musical material in the sense of loops like the stuff that we're providing in the library downloader, but just a bunch of cool stuff that you can use for doing soundtracks or even music. The album that I made last year, I got some samples of kids playing in a playground in South Africa. It's an incredible resource. We used to let you browse that from inside Ardour's import dialog, but then Freesound changed their authentication process, and it became impossible to do that anymore. Now you can do it again. the difference is, because of what Freesound did, is you have to have your own Freesound account, which you set up on their website. You're going to provide Ardour with your credentials one time. And after that, you can browse their collection from inside of the import dialog, the way unfa is showing here. You can preview and then you can download stuff. As I said, if you're doing work that needs the kinds of samples they have, very powerful. Really glad to have it back. Colin Fletcher in the UK was responsible for the changes to bring this back again. It was unfortunate that they changed their authentication stuff, but we understand why they did it. It wasn't anything weird or strange. They just switched to something a bit more conventional. I think, did you actually bring in a, oh yeah, okay, now it's asking for you to log in.
Yeah.
So
that makes perfect sense. That is amazing.
Yeah.
I've been using Freesound, especially Creative Commons Zero samples, sounds recordings, a lot in professional work for video game sound effects. Also, I have lots of my own stuff on Freesound, and I sometimes just fetch my own recordings off of it. So this will make things a lot easier and faster for me on that front. And I'm sure for a lot of other people working with sound effects or films, audio, like Foley and stuff.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So as I said, we had it many versions ago. I think it's been gone for at least 2 major versions, possibly more than that, but it's back. Lastly, on our major items list is a new feature that I don't actually think is going to be that useful to most people. Don't think we need to spend much time on it, but it's now possible to have what we call I/O plugins. And at the moment in Ardour, if you add a plugin, you're adding it to a track or to a bus, possibly to the monitor section, but it's running within the context of the session itself. It's connected to a track or a bus. And I/O plugins instead are plugins that run essentially outside of the session. They are handling audio coming in from your audio interface or audio going out to your audio interface. They're not connected to any tracks. Although they are saved, I believe, as part of the session, in most senses, they're not really a part of the session at all. They're doing processing on the audio before the session sees it and processing on the audio after the session has done its job of creating sound. These were created by Harrison for a specialized version of Mixbus that they make that uses a new sort of broadcast. It's a network audio and video protocol that's bubbling up in the industry. And so if you have a plugin, for example, that does network audio I/O, you can stick it in here and it just shows up as a new track input. Similarly, if you have one that does network audio output, you could stick it in as an I/O plugin, and it would be a new output for tracks.
There is an open source plugin called Sonobus. Actually, it's a standalone application. This is what comes to my mind as a use case for that. In the open source space.
Sonobus would have to get reworked a little bit to be usable in this context, but that would be exactly the kind of thing. I should also mention Sonobus was written by Jesse Chappell, who was was the second person to help develop Ardour and was very responsible for a lot of its early features. So yeah, there are some new possibilities for on the I/O plugin side, but it probably won't have much impact for most users. It's kind of a specialized thing to want to do. We got a bunch of improvements for control surfaces, mostly bug fixes and support for new devices. There's been a great improvement in anybody uses a push 2. Our pad tuning is now correct because Paul doesn't know music and got it all wrong the first time. When it says it goes up by fourths, it actually goes up by fourths now. And then we have a whole bunch of bug fixes, which I'm not going to go through, but just to say there's a whole bunch of things in here, many of which are very small, most of which will not affect most people, but for the people that they help, they'll be critical or will make them extremely happy, I think. And so all of that stuff will be out just as soon as we can get it packaged up and we feel comfortable that the bugs that remain are not total showstoppers.
So as soon as I stop breaking it, they'll send it out.
That would still leave unfa to.
Right? Yeah, Unfa, you got to get on that. Oh, I don't hear you.
Yeah, I gotta debug this.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, Paul, it's been amazing to have you here. I'm really grateful that you wanted to do this. We tried to do it for the audience. We tried to do this before, but we had to postpone the interview, and I'm happy that we did because we are much closer to Ardour's 7 release.
Yep. Well, it's been a great pleasure. I've enjoyed being here and talking through things. Sorry that we didn't get to answer everyone's questions, but
yeah, that's unfortunately just physically impossible. But you can always catch Paul in my community chat, so I'll plug that really soon.
I'm over there, and I'm on RSC, and you can reach us on the Ardour forums as well. So,
yep.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who has joined this stream. Thank you, John, for co-hosting. Once again, thank you, Paul, for coming and doing this interview. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you and geek out over all this stuff. And I also want to just thank you for making Ardour and for putting up with my bug reports and complaints and me sometimes writing, I can't see shit. That wasn't a particularly nice email from me, but I apologize if I ever was not very pleasant. And
well,
yeah.
if all of our bug reporters did as good of a job as you did, then we'd be a lot further along. So, and thank you for all that you do for free and open source music and other creative software, because that's a very valuable part of this whole effort too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Special thanks to Robin for hanging out in chat and answering some extra questions.
Yeah, thanks, Robin.
Yes, it's also great that Robin made it to the chat, and we've had about 90 people watching throughout the whole thing, which is quite a lot, and I'm really happy that we've had the audience that we had. Yep, it's time to say goodbye. So yeah, that's all. Thank you for joining this live stream. If you would like to catch Paul in the community chat, you can also go to the unfa community chat at chat.unfa.xyz. There is a Discord sign to it, but by default you'll go to Rocket Chat, which is open source, because open source. And also huge thanks to everyone who is supporting my work. If you are enjoying this and would like to help me keep doing stuff like that, you can go to patreon.com/unfa or liberapay.com/unfa. Wrong side. Sorry for the mic slap. And you can donate to me so I can keep making stuff and promoting open source software and having awesome guests. That's all for today. Now you should better go and make some music.